Section 1. The show that refuses to die. There is a television show that has been running since before the Berlin Wall came down. Before the internet existed in any form most people would recognize. Before streaming. Before social media. Before smartphones. Before most of the people currently watching this video were born. A show that has outlasted presidents, recessions, pandemics, the complete collapse and reinvention of the entertainment industry, and the attention span of an entire civilization. The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December, 1989. As of right now, it is still producing new episodes. 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. A run so long that it has become genuinely difficult to comprehend as a single continuous creative work, because no human being has ever made one of those before. Not at this scale, not in this format, not in prime time, with a consistent cast, consistent characters, and a consistent address. 742 Evergreen Terrace, Springfield. Same house, same family, same dog. 36 years. And the strange thing, the thing that sits at the very center of everything we are going to explore together tonight, is that almost nothing about this show makes logical sense when you actually stop and look at it. Not the characters, not the town, not the timeline, not the physics of the world the show inhabits, or the biology of the people who live inside it. The Simpsons has been on the air long enough to accumulate contradictions so deep and so structural that they stopped being mistakes a very long time ago and started being something closer to evidence. Evidence of what, exactly, is the question. There are people who have spent years mapping the inconsistencies of Springfield, cataloging the continuity errors, tracing the buried storylines the show introduced and never resolved, building theories so elaborate, so dense with canonical detail, that the show's own writers have been forced to address them publicly. Some of those theories are playful. Some of them are unsettling. And some of them, when you sit with them long enough in the dark, start to feel less like fan speculation and more like the actual story the show has been quietly telling underneath the one everyone assumes they're watching. This is a video for late nights. For the long, slow space between awake and asleep. For the hours when your mind loosens its grip on the day and the right kind of story can settle somewhere deeper than it normally would. So get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. We are going to talk about a family that never ages in a town that should not exist, and by the time we are finished, you may never see that yellow opening credit sequence quite the same way again. Let us start with the most obvious question, the one that gets asked constantly and never gets a satisfying answer. Why is it still on? Not in a dismissive way, not as criticism, as a genuine structural puzzle. Because the show's own mythology gives us a framework for understanding what The Simpsons was supposed to be, and what it was supposed to be has almost nothing to do with what it became. Matt Groening created The Simpsons in 1987 as a series of animated shorts for the Tracy Ullman Show. The idea at its core was simple and deeply American. A working-class family in a medium-sized American city. A father who drinks too much and works a job he hates. A mother who is smarter than the world gives her credit for. 3 kids who are, each in their own way, a little lost. The family was a comment on the kind of America that the 1980s had built, a country where the official story was prosperity and optimism, and the actual lived experience, for a lot of people, was something considerably more complicated. The show arrived on Fox as a full series in December 1989 and became, almost immediately, a cultural earthquake. It was unlike anything else on American television. It was fast. It was layered. It operated on multiple registers at once, a surface level of cartoon slapstick and a deeper level of genuine human sadness. It made you laugh, and then, a moment later, it made you feel something you weren't quite expecting to feel, because buried inside the joke was a small, precisely observed truth about what it is like to be alive and ordinary in a world that mostly rewards the extraordinary. The first 4 seasons of The Simpsons are widely considered among the greatest sustained runs in the history of television comedy. They are dense with character. The Homer of those early seasons is genuinely trying. He is incompetent in ways that feel earned rather than cartoonish. He loves his family in a way the show conveys without sentimentality, because the show knows that real love between imperfect people is complicated and unglamorous, and worth portraying honestly. Marge has depth. Lisa's alienation is acute and recognizable. Even Bart, the character who became the merchandising face of the show in 1990, is more than a slogan. He is a boy struggling with a school system designed to fail him, a father who is present but distracted, and an intelligence he has no framework for understanding because nobody around him has ever suggested that the kind of smart Bart is has any value. These are real observations about real American life. And they came from a writer's room that was, in those early years, genuinely one of the best collections of comedy writers ever assembled in one place. Al Jean, Mike Reiss, John Swartzwelder, Conan O'Brien, who wrote some of the defining episodes of the early run before leaving to host a late-night show. George Meyer, who, by some accounts, was the most influential voice in the room and who has described his approach to The Simpsons as an attempt to tell the truth about America in the only format America would accept it in. Animation, comedy, a cartoon family, a safe container for unsafe observations. So the show mattered. Genuinely mattered. And it ran for 4 seasons at that level, and then something shifted. The shift is gradual in the middle seasons. 5, 6, 7 still have extraordinary episodes scattered through them, but the direction of travel is clear in retrospect. The show moves from specific human observation towards something more broadly comedic. The plots become more elaborate and less emotionally grounded. Homer shifts from a flawed but recognizable figure to something more like a chaos engine, a character defined by slapstick consequence rather than inner life. The town of Springfield expands to accommodate an ever-growing roster of supporting characters, each of whom gets their own episodes, their own backstories, their own celebrity cameos. The Simpsons becomes, in other words, a franchise. And franchises do not end. They evolve, they expand, they find new markets and new formats, but they do not end, because ending is economically irrational when the intellectual property still has value. Which brings us to the puzzle. Because the show that exists in Season 35 is not the same show that existed in Season 3. It shares a name. It shares a cast. It shares an address. But the internal logic, the emotional register, the fundamental reason for existing those things have changed so completely that you could make a reasonable argument that they are different shows sharing a body. Like a philosophical ship of Theseus problem applied to animated television. At what point, as you replace every plank, does the ship stop being the original ship? The Simpsons writers have been aware of this question for a long time. They have addressed it inside the show itself, sometimes with genuine self-awareness, sometimes with a kind of defensive humor that functions as acknowledgement without quite being accountability. There is an episode in which the show essentially mocks its own declining quality. There are jokes about the longevity. There are meta-commentaries on the franchise machinery. The show has always been clever enough to see itself from the outside, which makes the question of why it keeps going even more interesting, because the people making it are not naive about what they are doing, and yet it keeps going. 36 years. Nearly 800 episodes. Here is the thing about a show that runs that long in a format that does not allow its characters to age. Here is the structural inevitability that nobody fully anticipated in 1989. When you freeze a family in amber, when you prevent them from growing older, from having the experiences that change people, when you insist that time passes around them without passing through them, you eventually create a problem that has no solution inside the logic of the show itself. The Simpsons cannot end in the conventional sense. They cannot have Bart grow up and move away, because Bart is 10 years old and will always be 10 years old, and that is the covenant the show made with its audience in 1989. They cannot have Homer retire from the plant, because the plant is the structure that holds the premise together. They cannot have Maggie speak, in any sustained or consequential way, because Maggie's silence is one of the few genuinely unresolved mysteries the show has preserved across its entire run, and resolving it would feel like something being lost rather than something being gained. So the show continues in a present tense that is also somehow always 1989. Springfield exists in a perpetual now that is, paradoxically, stuck in the past. The family watches episodes of Itchy and Scratchy that could have aired in 1991 and in 2023. Homer drives a car whose decade keeps shifting. Lisa's bedroom wall has posters that change with the cultural moment, without the room itself ever changing. The show insists on relevance while refusing the cost of relevance, which is change. And in that refusal, in that long amber suspension, something interesting has happened. The contradictions have accumulated. The inconsistencies have compounded. The buried storylines have grown over decades into something that looks less like continuity errors and more like a coded second text running underneath the official one. A show that is simultaneously a broad cartoon comedy for all ages and, if you read it the right way, a deeply strange document about time, identity, memory, radiation, and the things American families choose not to talk about. That second text is what we are going to spend the next several hours exploring. We are going to talk about the nuclear plant and what it has actually done to the residents of Springfield over 36 years. We are going to talk about the yellow skin and the four fingers and the theories about what those visual choices might actually represent inside the world of the show. We are going to sit with the Homer who had a crayon removed from his brain and the implications that storyline has for everything we thought we understood about the first 12 seasons. We are going to revisit the coma theory, the one that reframes the entire post-season 4 run of the show as something other than what it appears to be, and examine the canonical evidence for it with more seriousness than it usually gets. We are going to look at Mr. Burns. Really look at him. And we are going to ask what it means that a man who appears to be somewhere between 80 and 180 years old has remained in continuous operation as the most powerful person in Springfield for the entire run of the show. We are going to revisit who shot him and why the official resolution of that storyline feels, even now, like it might not be the whole truth. We are going to talk about Maggie, about what she knows, about what she has seen, about the small, precise moments the show has given us across 36 years that suggest her silence is not absence of thought, but its strategic concealment. We are going to spend time with Mona Simpson, Homer's mother, and the conspiracy that her storyline implies about the relationship between the Simpsons family, the Springfield nuclear power plant, and the man who owns it. We are going to talk about the episode that is widely considered the worst in the show's history, and make the case that it might actually be the most honest. We are going to catalog the predictions, the ones that came true, the ones that seem to be coming true, and the more interesting question of whether the show predicts the future or quietly shapes it. And at the end, we are going to sit with Ned Flanders and Hans Moleman and the floating timeline, and we are going to ask the question that the show itself is perhaps most afraid to answer. What does it mean that we keep pressing play? What does it mean that the audience has collectively chosen, for 36 years, to return to a family that cannot change, in a town that cannot grow, watching a story that cannot end? What need does that serve? What comfort does that provide? And what does it say about us about the relationship between an audience and a fictional family that we have, in some meaningful sense, prevented these people from aging by the sheer force of our continued attention? These are the questions underneath the questions. The ones that start to surface at 2 in the morning when the world is quiet and you have been watching the same yellow family for as long as you can remember. The Simpsons premiered on the 17th of December 1989. It is still running. And if you look at it the right way, if you approach it not as a decaying franchise grinding through its contractual obligations, but as a 36-year document about a specific kind of American life, then almost every inconsistency, almost every contradiction, almost every moment that seems like a mistake starts to resolve into something that feels more deliberate than accidental. Or maybe that is just what happens to stories that are long enough. Maybe they accumulate, meaning the way old houses accumulate character, not by design, but by time. Either way, we are going to look. We are going to look very carefully, and we are going to take our time. Before we go any further, if you are watching this late at night, if you found this video at the exact right moment, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love knowing who is on the other end of these videos. And if you want more nights like this one, hitting subscribe is the move. Okay? Let us keep going. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we leave the show's origins behind, because it matters for everything that follows. The Simpsons was, at its core, a show about failure. Not failure as tragedy, not failure as a cautionary tale, but failure as the baseline condition of a particular kind of American life. Homer fails at his job constantly and keeps the job anyway because the job is not about competence, it is about showing up. Marge fails to be the person she sometimes wishes she were calmer, less anxious, less acutely aware of how precarious everything is, and keeps going anyway, because going is the only option. Bart fails school with a consistency that should be alarming and is instead played as comedy, because in the Springfield of those first seasons, the school itself has also been failing for long enough that neither the institution nor the student has any illusions about what the relationship between them actually is. This is a show about people who know they are not winning and have found ways to keep living anyway. And that is, in the specific cultural moment of the late 1980s and early 1990s, an act of genuine honesty. The country had just finished a decade in which the official story was that everyone was winning, that the market was rewarding the deserving, that the deserving were the ones being rewarded, that if you were struggling, it was your own fault for not trying hard enough. The Simpsons built a family in the exact community that story was failing, and made them sympathetic and put them on Fox every Sunday night, and waited for America to recognize itself. America recognized itself immediately, and then the show became too popular to be fully honest anymore. Not dishonest in a deliberate way, the writers never stopped trying to be truthful in the smaller moments. But the popularity introduced pressures that honest storytelling could not fully accommodate. The network had stakes. The merchandise was selling. The brand had a value that needed protecting. The characters needed to remain recognizable, which meant they needed to remain as they had been introduced, which meant they needed to stay static in ways that real people living real lives would never have stayed static. Homer was supposed to accumulate experience. He was supposed to become, over time, someone who had been through things and was different for having been through them. The show's internal machinery ratings pressures, merchandise considerations, the network's interest in a consistent and sellable product kept redirecting the character back to the baseline, back to the couch, back to the plant, back to the moment just before anything he had been through could meaningfully change him. And over 36 years, the gap between the Homer who should have accumulated experience and the Homer who is always essentially the same has become, itself, a kind of evidence. Not evidence of lazy writing alone, though that has played its role. Evidence of something more structural, of the way that commercial forces act on fictional people, the same way that powerful forces act on real people, keeping them in place, preventing the changes that would cost the system something, ensuring that the status quo reproduces itself, because the status quo is what the system has an interest in maintaining. The Springfield we are going to spend the rest of tonight exploring is the product of 36 years of that process. It is what a town looks like after 3.5 decades of accumulated evidence that nothing can be done about anything. After a population fictional and real alike has spent long enough watching the same family fail and recover and fail again without consequence, that the pattern has stopped feeling like information and started feeling like the natural order of things. That is where we are going. Let us begin. But before we do, one last framing note for the hours ahead. Everything we are going to discuss tonight is grounded in the show's canonical text. The episodes exist. The details I will reference are in them. The patterns are real patterns, not invented, not extrapolated beyond what the show actually provides, but present in the material, waiting to be noticed by anyone who watches long enough and looks carefully enough. The theories we will explore are not facts. They are readings. Ways of organizing the evidence the show has accumulated into coherent accounts of what might be happening underneath the surface of what the show presents. Some of these readings are more supported than others. Some of them are speculative in ways I will try to flag when we get there. And some of them, particularly the radiation theory and the coma theory, are so well supported by the canonical text that the word theory starts to feel insufficient. They feel more like descriptions of what is actually there, dressed up in the speculative language that lets us approach them without the show having to officially acknowledge them. The show will never officially acknowledge them. That is fine. The show has been doing what it does for 36 years without our interpretation, and it will continue after tonight without being changed by anything we say about it. But understanding changes us, and sometimes that is enough. Settle in. This is going to take a while. And by the time we are done, the opening credits, the couch gag, the family running from all directions, the particular warmth of that Danny Elfman theme will hit differently. Everything hits differently when you know what you are looking at. Section 2. The nuclear elephant in the room. Let us talk about the plant. The Springfield nuclear power plant is not a background detail. It is not set dressing. It is the central structural fact of this show, and it has been hiding in plain sight for 36 years, and almost nobody talks about it with the seriousness it deserves. Consider what the plant actually is, within the logic of the show's world. It is a facility that, by every piece of evidence the show has ever given us, is catastrophically, almost incomprehensibly unsafe. It leaks. It malfunctions. It produces mutations in the local wildlife that are not subtle or ambiguous. They are grotesque and visible and documented within the show's own canon. It employs a man as its safety inspector who, in Season 1, is established to have gotten that job not through any qualification or training, but through a sequence of bureaucratic accidents that the show plays for comedy, but which, if you follow them to their logical conclusion, describe a workplace so negligent that its continued operation should be impossible. That man is Homer Simpson. And Homer's employment at the plant is, when you actually examine it, one of the strangest long-running jokes in the history of American television, because it is a joke with genuine stakes that the show has almost never chosen to fully acknowledge. Homer J. Simpson has, across the show's run, caused or nearly caused nuclear meltdown events on multiple occasions. He has fallen asleep at the safety console. He has introduced foreign objects into reactor coolant systems. He has, in at least one canonical episode, prevented a meltdown by pure accident through a sequence of errors that happened to cancel each other out. The plant has, in his tenure, released radioactive material into the local water supply. It has caused visible deformities in local fish. It has been investigated by federal regulators and passed inspections that, given everything the show has shown us about the facility, can only be explained by regulatory capture so complete that it has become indistinguishable from active conspiracy. And yet the plant continues to operate, and Homer continues to work there. And nobody in Springfield, not the residents, not the press, not the government, has ever successfully held the facility accountable for any of it. Let us slow down on that for a moment. Let us actually look at what the show tells us the plant has done to Springfield. In the episode Bart Gets Famous, there is a throwaway moment where a local resident mentions that the fish in Springfield River have an unusual number of eyes. This is played as a joke. It is a quick visual gag of fish with too many eyes, sold in a scene designed to make you laugh and move on. But if you treat that moment as a piece of information rather than a punchline, if you ask what it would actually require for riverfish to develop visible genetic mutations in a medium-sized American city, you arrive at a conclusion that is not funny at all. Sustained, significant radioactive contamination of the local water supply. Not a one-time spill. Not a single accident. The kind of long-term chronic environmental contamination that rewrites the DNA of the organisms living in it across multiple generations. That is what the three-eyed fish named Blinky represents. Blinky, who appeared in Season 2 in the episode 2 Cars in Every Garage and 3 Eyes on Every Fish, who became something of a mascot for the show's environmental satire, who is funny as a cartoon fish and deeply not funny as evidence. Because Blinky did not appear from nowhere. Blinky is the product of decades of contamination. Blinky is what happens when a nuclear facility operates without meaningful oversight for long enough that the local ecosystem begins to physically record what has been done to it. Blinky is the river telling the truth. In that Season 2 episode, a journalist catches Blinky while fishing with Bart, and the story becomes a political crisis for Mr. Burns, who is running for governor. Burns's response to the crisis is not to acknowledge the contamination or commit to remediation. His response is to have his team of scientists produce studies suggesting that the third eye is actually a mutation that confers evolutionary advantage, and then to arrange a dinner at the Simpson home where Marge serves Blinky as the main course to suggest that the fish is not only safe but desirable. Governor Bailey eats the fish during a televised moment and immediately spits it out. Burns loses the election. And the plant continues to operate. That detail matters. The sequence in that episode is not just political satire about how corporations manage environmental scandals. It is a precise description of a process that has played out in real American communities around real industrial facilities, and the show depicts it with enough accuracy that it functions as something between comedy and documentary. Burns does not deny the contamination in any absolute sense. He reframes it. He makes the contaminated fish the hero of its own story. He deploys enough scientific-sounding language to create sufficient doubt, and then he waits for the news cycle to move on. The news cycle moves on, and the plant continues to operate. Now, Springfield's geography matters here, and the show has never been fully consistent about it, which is itself interesting. Springfield exists somewhere in America. The show has deliberately kept the exact state ambiguous, an in-joke that the writers have maintained for decades, but it is a medium-sized Midwestern or Northeastern city with a river running through it, a mountain nearby, and an ocean at some indeterminate distance. The nuclear plant sits on the river. The river feeds into the broader watershed. The fish in the river have 3 eyes. What does a watershed with detectable genetic mutation levels in its fish population mean for the humans who live downstream of it? What does chronic, low-level radioactive contamination mean for a population that has lived adjacent to a leaking facility for, in the show's internal logic, several decades? This is where the show's most famous visual choice starts to look less like an artistic decision and more like a confession. We will come to the yellow skin in the next section. But before we get there, let us sit with the plant itself for a moment longer. Because the plant is not just a source of radiation, it is a source of employment. And that detail is crucial for understanding why Springfield has never successfully held it accountable. The Springfield nuclear power plant is, by every indication the show gives us, the largest single employer in Springfield. Homer works there. A significant portion of the adult male characters in the show's supporting cast are either employed at the plant or economically dependent on businesses that serve the people who work there. The plant is Springfield's economic engine. It is the reason the town has a tax base. It is the reason there is a school and a hospital and a police department, all of which are underfunded and dysfunctional in ways that might, if you were being uncharitable, look like the result of having your local economy entirely controlled by a single employer, with strong incentives to keep municipal institutions too weak to regulate him. Montgomery Burns understands this. The show tells us he understands it. There are episodes in which Burns explicitly discusses his relationship with the town as one of mutual dependency that he has structured to ensure his permanent advantage. He owns the power supply. He owns the employment base. And he has, across 36 seasons, demonstrated a consistent willingness to weaponize both of those facts against any individual or institution that threatens his position. The plant's safety record, in this context, is not an accident. It is a policy. A facility that was genuinely safe would require less oversight and produce less leverage. A facility that is chronically unsafe, whose workers understand that their jobs depend on not asking too many questions, whose operation the town cannot afford to scrutinize too closely because scrutiny might lead to shutdown, and shutdown would mean economic collapse. That facility is a machine for producing compliance, not just in the workers, in the town, in the regulatory environment, in the political culture of Springfield itself. Homer Simpson is not just a safety inspector who is bad at his job. Homer Simpson is the safety inspector the plant was designed to have. Someone whose qualifications are poor enough that he will never identify the problems he is supposed to catch. Someone whose economic dependence on the job is complete enough that even if he did identify problems, he would face enormous personal cost for reporting them. Someone whose family is rooted enough in Springfield that the threat of plant closure implicit in any serious regulatory action would register as a personal threat. Homer is the plant's best defense against accountability. Not because he is malicious, because he is human, and the system has been arranged to make his humanity the mechanism of his own capture. Season 1 of the show gives us a moment that, in retrospect, is one of the most quietly devastating things the series ever did. In the episode Homer's Odyssey, Homer's chronic inattention causes a near accident at the plant, and he is fired. He spends several episodes unemployed and depressed before eventually being rehired in a different capacity. The episode plays as comedy about Homer's incompetence, but the background detail that the near accident happened because Homer fell asleep at his post, and that the plant's response was to fire Homer rather than to examine the conditions that led to the incident, tells you almost everything you need to know about the plant's relationship with worker safety. The accident is attributed to human error. The human is removed. The system continues. This is the nuclear power industry's oldest rhetorical move, and The Simpsons depicts it perfectly in what appears to be a throwaway episode about Homer getting a new job. Now let us talk about the specific mechanics of what the plant leaks and where it goes. The show is not consistent about the precise form of the contamination. Sometimes it is radioactive waste. Sometimes it is unnamed byproducts. Sometimes it is presented as a green, glowing substance of somewhat ambiguous composition, but the consistency of the environmental effect is hard to ignore across the run of the show. Springfield's river is contaminated. Springfield's groundwater shows anomalies in episodes that play them as gags. There is a dump established in early seasons where the plant disposes of waste in conditions that, even in the context of a cartoon, look environmentally catastrophic. There is a moment in one episode where waste barrels are shown having been used as garden furniture by a family that clearly does not understand what is in them. That last detail is the one that stays with me, because it is not a moment about malice. It is a moment about information asymmetry. The plant knows what is in those barrels. The family does not. The family has made those barrels part of their domestic landscape because someone through negligence or deliberate misdirection allowed them to be accessible. And the show plays this for a quick laugh and moves on, and underneath the laugh is something that is genuinely not funny at all. This is a consistent technique in the show's early seasons. The comedy is real, the laugh is earned, and embedded inside the laugh is a piece of information that, if you let it settle, changes the texture of what you have just watched. The plant does not just contaminate the environment, it contaminates the information environment. It operates in a town where people do not know what they are living with, where the visible evidence of contamination, three-eyed fish, unusual local health statistics, the particular quality of the glow that emanates from the reactor when certain workers get close to it is so normalized over time that it has stopped registering as evidence, and at the center of all of it is Homer, who glows occasionally, in episodes where the show forgets to suppress that detail, who has, in multiple canonical moments, been described as demonstrably radioactive by instruments that register his body as a source rather than merely an exposure, who works in the most dangerous room in the facility 5 days a week without adequate protective equipment, according to the show's own visual record of the safety conditions in his workplace. Homer is not just adjacent to the contamination. Homer is, in a very specific and canonically supported sense, the contamination's primary human carrier in Springfield. What that means for his family, for his children, for the biology of the Simpson household, we are going to spend several sections exploring that. But before we leave the plant entirely, there is one more thing worth noticing. The plant has a number. It is Nuclear Power Plant Number 1, according to early canonical references. Not the only plant in the region, number 1, which implies that there are others, which implies that Springfield's nuclear infrastructure is not a single facility but a network owned by the same man, operating under the same regulatory conditions, producing the same environmental effects in whatever communities are unlucky enough to be built around them. If that is true, then the story of Springfield is not unique. It is a template. It is what happens to a town when a man like Burns sets up shop and stays there for long enough. And the fact that the show has never fully pursued that implication, has never connected the plant to a broader network of effects, has kept Springfield isolated as a case study rather than an example, might be its own kind of evidence about what the show is allowed to say and what it has chosen to leave in the dark. But there is one more thread worth pulling before we move on, because it connects the plant to everything else we are going to explore tonight. The people who work at the plant, not just Homer, but the wider workforce, are depicted across the show's run as existing in a particular kind of relationship with their employer and their work. They are not people who chose their jobs through passion or vocation. They are people who took the jobs available to them in the community they lived in, and the community they lived in has one large employer, and that employer is Burns. They are, in the most technical sense, a captive labor force. Not captive because they cannot leave, but captive in the way that people with families and mortgages and local roots are captive by the accumulated weight of a life built in one place, which makes leaving enormously craving when staying is slowly doing something to you. Homer articulates this, in his inarticulate way, across dozens of episodes. He does not want to be at the plant. He has never wanted to be at the plant. He has tried at various points across the show's run to leave the plant to find other work, to pursue other paths, to become other versions of himself. And something always brings him back, usually economic reality, sometimes circumstance. Once or twice, something that reads less like choice, and more like an inability to imagine himself outside the context the plant provides. The plant is Homer's prison, not a dramatic bars and guards prison, the soft, ordinary prison of economic dependency and accumulated life, which is the kind of prison that most people live in, and which is effective not because it is dramatic, but because it is invisible. Homer does not feel imprisoned, he feels employed. The difference is real but smaller than it should be. And this is the plant's deepest trick. It does not chain people to itself with force. It chains them with paychecks and health insurance and the slow accumulation of a life that makes leaving unthinkable. And then, once people are chained in that invisible way, it does whatever it was always going to do, leaking, dumping, operating at the edge of disaster in the knowledge that the people most affected by what it is doing are the people least able to afford to do anything about it. Springfield is not a unique story. That is the most uncomfortable thing about it. Let us be specific about what we mean by that. The Simpsons is set in a fictional town with fictional characters in a world where physics are somewhat negotiable and consequences are largely reversible. None of this is a real place. But the pattern it depicts the industrial facility operating without meaningful oversight in a community economically dependent on it, the regulatory capture that keeps inspections toothless, the way that the people most harmed by an operation are the people least positioned to challenge it. This pattern is not fictional. It has a name in environmental justice literature. It has case files. It has specific communities in specific American states and specific chemical compounds and specific health outcome data that track precisely with what the fictional Springfield depicts in cartoon form. The Simpsons made this pattern funny and put it on primetime television, and the country watched it for 36 years, and the pattern continued in the real world essentially uninterrupted. The show depicted regulatory capture as absurdism. The regulatory capture continued. The show depicted the environmental health consequences as mutation jokes. The environmental health consequences continued. The show depicted the economic dependency trap as Homer's inability to imagine leaving. The economic dependency trap continued. The show was a mirror held up at an angle that made the reflection look like a cartoon. And because it looked like a cartoon, because the faces were yellow and the fingers were 4 and the fish had 3 eyes and the safety inspector was a man with a crayon in his skull, the reflection was receivable in a way that a straight documentary would not have been. We received it. We laughed. We came back the following week, and the plant kept leaking. The point is not that The Simpsons failed in some social responsibility it should have discharged. The point is that the mechanism of satire, the way that making something funny makes it bearable, makes it receivable, makes it possible to look at directly, is also the mechanism by which the thing being satirized is preserved. We laugh at the Springfield nuclear power plant's safety record, and the laugh lets us set it down. We do not have to keep holding it. We do not have to do anything with what it showed us, because the comedy has discharged the urgency. Springfield's plant is still running, and so are the real ones it was designed to make us think about. The mirror was pointed right at us. The cartoon kept us from recognizing ourselves in it. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the central paradox of the show's cultural function. The Simpsons works as satire because it is funny. It is funny because it is a cartoon. It is a cartoon because cartoons are the format that allows the observations to be made without the observations becoming intolerable. If you made a prestige drama about a nuclear plant systematically poisoning a working-class community while regulatory capture kept accountability permanently out of reach, it would be important and very hard to watch, and it would be watched by a relatively small audience of people who were already predisposed to agree with it. You make it a cartoon. You give the safety inspector a crayon in his brain and a donut obsession. You give the billionaire a villain's aesthetic and a comedy voice. You give the 3-eyed fish a name. And then you put it on Sunday night at 8 o'clock, and 100 million people watch it, and they laugh, and they absorb it, and they go to bed, and on Monday morning nothing has changed. The price of being that widely seen is that the seeing does not translate into the kind of discomfort that produces action. The comedy is the mechanism, and the mechanism's cost. It is what makes the show possible and what keeps the show safe. Burns never faces consequences because the show is not in the business of producing consequences. The plant never shuts down because the plant's continued operation is the premise of the show, and the show must continue. Springfield keeps running. The satire keeps running alongside it. And we keep watching both. Section 3. The yellow problem. Here is a question that almost nobody asks about The Simpsons, because the answer seems so obvious that the question feels unnecessary. Why are they yellow? The standard answer, the one Matt Groening has given in interviews over the decades, the one that appears in documentaries and retrospectives and pieces about the show's visual history, is simple. Groening wanted the show to be instantly visually distinct on television. Yellow skin would prevent the viewer from channel surfing past it without registering what they were seeing. At the time of the show's creation, no animated characters were yellow. The choice was purely about differentiation in the marketplace. That is a clean, satisfying answer. It is also, when you examine it against the actual visual logic of the show, not entirely sufficient. Because if the yellow skin were purely a design choice, a stylistic decision with no meaning inside the world of the show, then it would apply uniformly. Every character would be yellow. The show would not need to make any distinction between who is yellow and who is not. But that is not what The Simpsons does. The Simpsons is extremely precise, across its entire run, about exactly who is yellow and who is not. The residents of Springfield are yellow. The visitors to Springfield are not. This is not an absolute rule with no exceptions. There are moments throughout the show's history where the rule is inconsistently applied, where a background character who should be yellow by this logic appears with a more conventional skin tone, or where a recurring Springfield resident appears with a color that does not match the pattern. The show is 36 years old and animated by teams that have changed substantially over that time. Perfect consistency would be impossible, but the pattern is there, and it is consistent enough that it cannot be accidental. Think about the guest stars. The show has had hundreds of them. Musicians, athletes, politicians, actors, public figures of every kind. And in almost every case, the guest star appears as themselves a recognizable version of their actual appearance, with their actual skin tone, in a cartoon world populated by yellow characters. Michael Jackson in the legendary Season 3 episode appears with his actual skin. Paul McCartney, Meryl Streep, Dustin Hoffman, Tom Hanks, all of them appear in their canonical human coloring, not in Springfield yellow. And then there are the characters who are visitors to Springfield but are not real people, fictional characters from other episodes, relatives from other towns, characters who travel to Springfield and then leave. In many of these cases, the same principle applies. Non-Springfield characters appear in conventionally human tones. Now, this could still be a design choice, a way of visually distinguishing locals from visitors, of making guest appearances more recognizable. That explanation works on a craft level, but let us sit with what it implies inside the world of the show. If the yellow skin marks the permanent residents of Springfield, the people who were born there, who grew up there, who have spent their lives in proximity to that plant on the river, then the yellow skin is not a random characteristic. It is a local characteristic. It is something that Springfield has and the rest of the world does not. Something that distinguishes the people of this town from the people of every other town. Something that the Springfield nuclear power plant has been producing for decades. The mutation theory is not new. Fans and cultural critics have been circling it for years. The proposition is straightforward. The yellow skin of Springfield's residents is the visible marker of multi-generational radiation exposure. It is what chronic, low-level contamination does to a population over time, not killing them, not causing acute illness, but gradually and irreversibly altering the biology of the people who live within its range. The fish in the river grew a third eye. The humans grew yellow skin, and then stopped noticing, because that is what chronic environmental contamination does to communities that live with it long enough. The visible effect normalizes. It becomes the local baseline. The people of Springfield do not look at each other and see yellow skin and think something is wrong, any more than a town built near a coal plant notices the particular quality of the air after 30 years. The normal becomes invisible. The damage becomes the definition of health. What makes this theory compelling is not just the visual logic, it is the four-fingered hand. Every character in The Simpsons has 4 fingers. This is another choice that is typically attributed to animation tradition. 4 fingers is easier to draw than 5, and the simplified hand became a convention in early American animation that many cartoons adopted. That is true. That explanation is historically accurate. But again, if we ask what it means inside the world of the show, if we refuse the meta-explanation and insist on treating the show's visual choices as information rather than convention, The four-fingered hand starts to look like something specific. Polydactyly and its inverse. The loss of digits, or the fusion of digits under certain environmental conditions, is a documented effect of radiation exposure in developing organisms. The specific mechanism varies by type and level of exposure, but the principle is well established in the scientific literature. Animals and organisms that develop in contaminated environments show higher rates of limb abnormalities, digit changes, and structural variations than those that develop in clean environments. Springfield's residents have 4 fingers. Springfield's visitors have 5. The same pattern that applies to the skin color applies to the hands. Local residents, abnormal. Visitors from outside Springfield, normal. The line between yellow and 4-fingered and conventionally human and 5-fingered corresponds, with striking precision, to the line between people who have spent their lives in Springfield and people who have not. Now, I want to be careful here. The show did not set out to make a documentary about radiation exposure. The animation choices were made for stylistic and practical reasons. I am not suggesting that Groening sat down in 1987 and designed a systematic theory of nuclear contamination and encoded it into the character designs. What I am suggesting is that those design choices, once made and once applied consistently across a show that is also explicitly about a nuclear plant and its effects on a local community, create a visual argument that is coherent whether it was intended or not. Intentionality is not always the most interesting thing about a story. Sometimes the most interesting thing is what a story reveals about its own assumptions without meaning to. The assumption embedded in The Simpsons' visual design is that Springfield is a place that does something to the people who live there. That living in Springfield produces visible, heritable, physical difference. That the residents of 742 Evergreen Terrace are yellow and 4-fingered, not because they were born that way in some neutral sense, but because the town they were born into, the town with the plant, with the glowing river, with the 3-eyed fish, has shaped their biology in ways that are now indistinguishable from their natural state. Marge's hair is another piece of this. The famous blue beehive is absurd in a way that the show has acknowledged and occasionally addressed. In a Season 7 episode, we learn that Marge's hair is naturally gray, she dyes it blue, and has since before Bart was born. But the visual result is still that distinctive, impossible tower of hair, a structure that defies conventional physics in a way the show never explains. What if the explanation is that the hair, like the skin, like the hands, is a physical artifact of the environment? What if the beehive is not a styling choice, but a symptom, something that happened to Marge's hair over time, in the way that things happen to organisms in contaminated environments, and that she has maintained and styled because accepting it was easier than questioning it? This is speculation. I want to be honest about that. But speculation that is internally consistent with the show's visual logic and thematic preoccupations is worth taking seriously, especially when it converges with other lines of evidence. Let us talk about Homer's skin specifically. Because Homer is the Simpson family member most directly exposed to the plant's radiation, and Homer is the Simpson family member whose biology is most visibly and dramatically different from baseline human normal. Homer Simpson is, by every canonical measurement the show has given us, an extraordinarily resilient physical entity. He survives things that would kill an ordinary human being not occasionally, not as a one-time miracle, but routinely and consistently across nearly 800 episodes. He falls from great heights. He is hit by cars. He is subjected to violence that would be fatal in any realistic context. He ingests substances that should cause acute organ failure. He absorbs electrical shocks and chemical exposures and blunt impacts that, in combination and across time, represent a cumulative physical toll that no unmodified human body could accommodate. And he keeps going. The cheerful narrative explanation for this is that Homer is a cartoon character in a cartoon show, and cartoon characters do not obey the laws of physics. That is true. But again, the show is also, simultaneously, a show about a family with a continuous internal logic that it takes seriously enough to build stories around. And within that logic, Homer's physical resilience is something the show has occasionally tried to explain. The most direct attempt is the crayon. We will spend an entire section on the crayon because it deserves that attention. But the radiation angle is worth addressing here because it is the older and more structurally embedded explanation. The idea is that Homer's extraordinary physical durability is a product of his long-term radiation exposure. That the same process that turned his skin yellow and his hands four-fingered has also, over the course of his working life at the plant, produced a kind of biological adaptation. His cells repair differently than they should. His pain response has been altered. His capacity to absorb damage without sustaining permanent injury is not slapstick immunity, but a genuine physiological modification, a consequence of spending decades in environments that would be acutely dangerous for an unmodified person. This is, if we are honest, a dark reading of what the show has been doing with Homer's body, but it is a reading that the show's own logic supports, because the plant has changed everything else in Springfield that it has touched. Why would the man who works closest to the reactor be an exception? There is a moment in a Season 5 episode where Homer's body, after prolonged exposure, shows measurable radioactivity that registers on instruments outside the plant. This is played as a gag, but a gag where Homer's body is emitting detectable radiation means that Homer's body has been absorbing detectable radiation in sufficient quantity to be emitting it back. That is not a cartoon metaphor. That is a physical description of a man who has become, in some meaningful sense, a radioactive source. And he brings that home every day. To Marge, to Bart, to Lisa, to baby Maggie. The plant does not stay at the plant. It follows Homer home. It is in his hair, his skin, his clothes. It is in the material of his daily life, the cups he drinks from, the chair he sits in, the air in the rooms he occupies. The contamination is not contained behind the plant's reactor room door. The contamination is distributed across Springfield through every worker who goes home at the end of each shift. This is the yellow problem. It is not a design choice anymore, viewed from this angle. It is a record. A slow and visible record of what happens to a community that lives with a certain kind of industrial neighbor for long enough that the effects of that neighbor become indistinguishable from the community's identity. Springfield is yellow because Springfield is contaminated, and Springfield has been contaminated for so long that the contamination has become Springfield. One more detail before we move on. The show has, on 3 separate occasions across its run, shown Springfield winning or being nominated for awards related to environmental health, civic pride, or quality of life. These moments are played as absurdist comedy. Springfield winning any quality of life award is obviously ridiculous given everything we know about the town, but there is a layer of horror inside the absurdism, because the organizations giving those awards are presumably using some kind of measurement system. And if Springfield's three-eyed fish and glowing river and chronic municipal dysfunction are still within the acceptable parameters of those measurements, then either the measurements are corrupt, or the organizations are captured, or, and this is the reading that keeps me up at night, Springfield is not actually unusually bad. Springfield is average. Springfield is what an American town looks like when an American company has operated without meaningful oversight for long enough. And the fact that it looks like a joke is the mechanism by which we are prevented from recognizing it as a description. There is one more visual detail worth examining before we move to the next layer of this. The show depicts, in its wider shots of Springfield, a skyline that is dominated by those 2 cooling towers. They are the visual signature of the town. Not the church steeple, not the town hall, not any civic monument. The cooling towers, they appear in the distance of exterior shots throughout the show's run, a constant background presence that functions exactly the way nuclear plants function in the communities that surround them, as something so persistent, so normalized, so woven into the visual fabric of daily life, that residents stop seeing them as remarkable. They are just there. They have always been there. They will always be there. And beneath them, in the houses and streets and schools that fill out the foreground of those shots, the yellow people go about their yellow lives. The cooling towers are always in frame. We stopped noticing them too. There is one more aspect of the mutation theory that deserves attention, because it connects the visual evidence to something emotional at the center of the show. Lisa Simpson is the character most often discussed as the most intelligent member of the family, and she is. But Lisa's intelligence has a specific texture that the show has depicted with enough consistency that it starts to look less like a personality trait and more like a syndrome. Lisa does not just perceive things clearly. She perceives things with a kind of overwhelming acuity that makes the world she lives in constantly painful. She feels what Springfield does to its inhabitants. She understands, at 8 years old, more about the structural failures of the community she lives in than most of Springfield's adults will ever understand. And this understanding is not a gift. It is a burden. It is something she carries around inside a body that is too small and a life that is too constrained to give it anywhere to go. Lisa's intelligence might be the mutation expressing itself as heightened perception. The same environmental contamination that reduced Homer's cognitive capacity, amplifying in Lisa the processing speed and emotional sensitivity that make her who she is. The result is a child who can see everything with extraordinary clarity and who lives in a place where seeing clearly is the loneliest condition available. Then there is Bart. Bart's relationship to intelligence is different from either Homer's or Lisa's. Bart is not stupid. The show has established this repeatedly. His academic failure is not the result of cognitive inability, but of a specific mismatch between how his mind works and how Springfield Elementary is designed to work. He has spatial intelligence, creative intelligence, the ability to plan complex social maneuvers and execute them with a precision that his report cards would not suggest he possesses. He is brilliant at the things that are not taught in school, and poor at the things that are, in a pattern that real educational psychology has documented extensively in real children. Bart's mutation, if we apply the framework, might be the contamination working on whatever specific cognitive architecture he was born with, heightening the lateral, unconventional, authority-resistant aspects while leaving the formal academic ones underserved, making him more himself in ways that the environment has decided to classify as failure. 3 children from the same household, the same water supply, the same yellow air under the same cracked cooling towers. 3 completely different cognitive expressions of the same environmental variable. Homer, diminished. Lisa, amplified in ways that hurt. Bart, sideways. Maggie, something else entirely that we cannot yet measure. The plant did not do the same thing to everyone it touched. It did different things to different people depending on what was there to begin with. And the family portrait that results one profoundly impaired adult, 3 children each expressing the same contamination in radically different directions, is one of the most quietly strange things the show has ever assembled. We look at them and see a family. We see the yellow faces and the 4 fingers and the specific chaos of that household. We see the comedy. The show has been telling us, for 36 years, that what we are looking at is also a medical case study. We have been watching the symptoms and calling them characters, and now sit with the specific way the show has framed this over the decades. The Simpsons has always been described by its creators as a satire of American family life, a comedy about the ordinary, an exaggerated but recognizable portrait of the middle class. These framings are all accurate on one level. They describe what the show looks like from a comfortable, critical distance. But there is another framing available. A show about a family whose bodies have been physically altered by industrial contamination, living in a town that cannot acknowledge this because the contamination and the town's economy are the same thing, produced by a corporation whose owner is alive past all natural limits and who keeps himself alive using the same substance he is pumping into the community around him. That framing is also accurate. It is supported by the same evidence as the first one. The only difference is how far you are willing to follow what the show actually shows you. The yellow skin is the show showing you. Every episode is the show showing you. We just kept laughing and looking away. Section 4. Homer's Brain and What Was Done to It. In the 12th season of The Simpsons, in an episode titled Homer the Mo, or more precisely, in an episode titled HOMR with a period after each letter, standing for nothing, because the title is itself a kind of joke about the premise, the show does something that should have been more significant than it was. It reveals that Homer Simpson is not stupid because he was born that way. Let us take that slowly. The episode begins with Bart, in an act of characteristic mischief, enrolling Homer in a program that gives him an IQ test. The test comes back and the number is 55, which is, to be precise about what that number means, a score that would indicate profound intellectual disability in a real human being, not mild cognitive difficulty, not below average intelligence. 55 is a number that in clinical terms describes someone who requires significant support to navigate daily life. And Homer is upset about this. Briefly, in the way that Homer is upset about things in the seasons after the show's first peak with the kind of cartoonish distress that resolves quickly and does not linger. But then the episode does something interesting. It takes Homer to a doctor, and the doctor, examining his x-rays, finds something, a crayon, lodged in Homer's brain, specifically in the left hemisphere, in a region that the show identifies as affecting higher cognitive function. And the doctor's conclusion, played as dark comedy but presented with enough internal seriousness that the show intends you to take it at face value, is that the crayon has been there since Homer was a child. Since he pushed it up his nose as a small boy, where it traveled through his nasal cavity and lodged in his brain, and has been sitting there, suppressing his intelligence for his entire adult life. The crayon is removed, and Homer, freed from the impediment, becomes immediately and measurably more intelligent. He solves complex math problems, he reads literature, he begins to engage with the world around him at a level that his wife and children find genuinely unfamiliar. He writes a film review. He befriends Lisa in a way that the show has never quite managed before, because for the first time in the series, Homer and Lisa are operating at something close to the same cognitive register. And then, and this is the part that gets to me, every time Homer chooses to put it back. Not because the intelligence makes him unhappy in an abstract sense, Homer with the crayon removed is not a bad or sad man. He is, if anything, more capable of genuine connection, more able to articulate his feelings, more present with his family in the ways that matter. But the intelligence isolates him. It puts him at odds with his friends, who find him insufferable. It makes him aware of things he was previously protected from, being aware of the depth of Springfield's environmental and civic problems, the statistical likelihood that his working conditions will shorten his life, the gap between what he wanted his life to be and what it is. And he cannot unknow those things. He cannot unsee them. The intelligence, it turns out, is in some ways a more painful condition than the incapacity was. And so Homer makes an appointment with a different Dr. Moe, working from the bar with a crayon and no medical training, and has a new crayon inserted, and wakes up with his IQ back at 55 and is immediately, visibly relieved. The episode is funny. It is also one of the most quietly devastating things the show has done, because it takes a character we have been laughing at for 12 seasons and tells us that we were not laughing at his natural state. We were laughing at a man with a foreign object suppressing his brain function, who had no idea that was happening to him, and who, when offered the chance to exist at his full capacity, found that capacity so painful that he chose to return to the impairment. The implications of this are enormous, and the show has never fully reckoned with them. First, if Homer's IQ is 55 with the crayon in, what is his IQ without it? The episode suggests his intelligence with the crayon removed is substantial, possibly in the gifted range, though the show does not give us a precise number, which means that the Homer we have watched for 12 seasons, the Homer of every slapstick misadventure, every failed scheme, every moment of baffling incomprehension, that Homer is not the actual Homer. That Homer is what the actual Homer looks like with his intelligence artificially suppressed. Second, the crayon went in when Homer was a child, which means that Homer's entire school career, his entire adolescence, his courtship of Marge, his decision to marry her when she became pregnant, his choice to take the job at the plant, all of that happened while he was operating at approximately 55 IQ. His life's trajectory was set by the suppressed version of himself. He did not choose to be a safety inspector in a nuclear plant because that was the best his full potential could do. He chose it or stumbled into it because that was the best a man with an improvised cranial crayon could do. Third, and this one is the hardest to sit with, when Homer has the crayon removed in the episode, he writes a letter to Marge before deciding to reinsert it. In that letter, he tells her that he loves her and has always loved her, but that he now understands things that he could not understand before, and that understanding them has made him see their life together differently. He does not elaborate. The letter is brief and tender and slightly heartbreaking. And then he walks to the bar and has Moe put the crayon back in and does not remember writing the letter, and the episode ends. What was in that difference? What did Homer without the crayon see about his life with Marge that Homer with the crayon is protected from seeing? The show does not tell us. It lets that question hang in the air and then moves on to the next episode as if nothing has changed, which is, in some ways, exactly what Homer himself does. But it has changed. Within the show's internal logic, the HOMR episode has changed everything that comes before it and everything that comes after it, because it retroactively reframes the entire Homer Simpson project. The question is no longer simply, why is Homer the way he is? The question becomes, what kind of person was Homer Simpson supposed to be? And what would his life have looked like if a small boy had never pushed a yellow crayon up his nose on an afternoon we never saw? There are fan theories about this that go further than the show itself is willing to go. The most elegant of them connects the crayon to the radiation, and the connection is worth considering even if it is speculative. The theory runs like this. Homer's cognitive suppression is not the result of a single accident with a crayon. The crayon is a visible, physical event that stands in for a longer process. What if the crayon remained in place for so long, for decades, precisely because the surrounding neural environment made its impact more severe? What if the radiation exposure that Homer has been accumulating since childhood, living in Springfield, living in proximity to the plant, made the suppression worse than it would have been in an uncontaminated person? What if the crayon and the radiation are part of the same story, two mechanisms working in the same direction, both suppressing a man who was born with considerably more capacity than his circumstances allowed him to express? This is not something the show confirms. But it is consistent with the show's logic, because the show's logic consistently treats Homer's body as something that has been worked on by its environment. The radiation has altered his skin. It has altered his physical resilience. Is it so much further to suggest that it has also, in ways that compound the crayon's mechanical effect, altered the cognitive function that the crayon was already compromising? What we know for certain from the canonical text of Homer is this. Homer Simpson's intelligence was not a fixed and natural thing. It was the result of a physical intervention that he did not consent to, did not know about, and whose effects shaped the entire trajectory of his life. And the show, having revealed this, chose not to pursue it, chose to reinsert the crayon, reset the premise, and return to the 55 IQ Homer as if the revelation had not happened, which is its own kind of comment on something, because the show has done this several times across its run. It has revealed something structural about a character, something that reframes everything we thought we knew, and then stepped back from the revelation and allowed the status quo to reassemble around it. Burns's various reversals of power and vulnerability. The episodes that suggest Marge's happiness is more conditional than the show normally acknowledges. The moments where Bart's intelligence flares into visibility before being suppressed again, the show reveals and then conceals, opens doors and then gently closes them. The crayon is the most overt version of this pattern, and it is worth asking whether the pattern itself is meaningful. Whether the show's consistent choice to reveal and then undo is a comment on the way that American families, American communities, American institutions deal with inconvenient truths. You find the thing, you hold it for a moment, and then you put it back, because the alternative, actually living with what you know, is more than the system can absorb. Homer puts the crayon back because the intelligence is painful. Springfield tolerates the three-eyed fish because the alternative, acknowledging what the plant has done, is economically ruinous. The show reveals its own decline and then continues anyway, because the alternative is cancellation, and cancellation is unacceptable to the franchise economy. The pattern is the same at every scale. Now, I want to spend some time on what the 55 IQ actually means for the show's first 11 seasons, because if the crayon explains Homer's cognitive state for most of the show's run, then some of the things we have attributed to stupidity need to be reread. A person operating at an IQ of 55 is not simply slow to understand things. The cognitive profile is specific. Working memory is significantly impaired. Abstract reasoning is limited. Novel problem-solving is difficult. But procedural memory, the capacity to learn and retain routine tasks, is often relatively preserved. And emotional intelligence, which is not well measured by IQ tests, can be entirely intact or even heightened. Homer, across the show's run, shows exactly this profile when you look carefully. He cannot navigate abstract problems when presented with a novel situation requiring reasoning from first principles. He fails. He cannot hold multiple pieces of information in mind simultaneously. His plans unravel because he loses track of their component parts. He is, in the conventional sense, exactly what an IQ of 55 predicts. But Homer also, in the show's best moments, demonstrates an emotional intelligence that is entirely inconsistent with genuine cognitive disability. His love for his family is not a simple or reflexive thing. It is something he navigates with nuance, even when the navigation is inarticulate. He knows when Marge is unhappy. He knows, in specific and often accurate ways, what Bart needs from him even when he cannot provide it. He understands Lisa's alienation in a way that his surface behavior rarely shows, but that occasionally breaks through in moments of real connection. These emotional capacities are not things a 55 IQ eliminates. They are, if the theory about the crayon is correct, the residue of the higher intelligence underneath. The things that the crayon could suppress, the abstract reasoning, the planning, the verbal facility are suppressed. The things the crayon could not suppress, the fundamental human capacity for love and connection and grief, are not. And that gives us Homer. That specific, distinctive, exasperating, occasionally heartbreaking combination of functional incompetence and genuine feeling. That is what a man looks like when his intelligence has been suppressed but his humanity has not. When the cognitive architecture has been impaired but the emotional one has not. When the device in his head has taken away his capacity to think clearly without being able to touch whatever it is in him that loves. Which is, when you sit with it, one of the most interesting things The Simpsons has ever done, whether it meant to or not. And there is a question embedded in the HOMR episode that the show raises and then, characteristically, does not pursue. When Homer chose to reinsert the crayon, who made that choice? The man who made it was the high IQ Homer, the articulate, clear-eyed, socially isolated Homer, who had just spent enough time with his full cognitive capacity to understand exactly what he was choosing to give up. That Homer, in possession of his full intelligence, looked at what being intelligent in Springfield meant and decided that he would rather be without it, which is either a commentary on intelligence, or a commentary on Springfield, or a commentary on the specific way that power arranges its environments so that the cost of seeing clearly is always higher than the cost of remaining blind. A truly open environment would make intelligence an asset. In Springfield, intelligence is a liability. It makes you miserable. It shows you things you cannot unsee. It puts you at odds with a community that has collectively agreed to maintain its comfortable fog, and the community's preference for the fog is, in the aggregate, stronger than any individual's capacity to dispel it. Homer chose the fog, and in choosing it, he chose Springfield. He chose the family. He chose the couch, and the beer, and the plant, and the comfortable, limited, warm, and genuinely loving life that the crayon allows him to inhabit. The intelligence was the truth. The crayon is the Springfield version of the vote. There is a scene in the Homer episode that I want to return to because I think it is the most economical and precise thing the show ever did with the Homer and Lisa relationship. When the crayon is removed and Homer's intelligence increases, he and Lisa go for a walk together in Springfield. They talk. Really talk in the way that the show only rarely allows them to talk, where the conversation has intellectual substance and emotional depth, and both of them are operating at registers they can each access. And Lisa, in that scene, says something that breaks her own heart as she says it. She says something to the effect that she has always wanted a father who could understand her. A parent she could talk to in the full sense. And Homer, with the crayon removed, for the first time in his life can be that. He understands her. He talks back. They have the conversation she has been waiting her entire life to have. And then he goes and puts the crayon back. She does not know, at first, that the crayon has returned. She calls. The Homer on the phone sounds like the old Homer. The conversation does not work the way the walk worked. And she understands. The episode ends with a note. Homer, before reinserting the crayon, left a note for Lisa. The note is read aloud by the series voice. It tells her that he loves her, in the simple and direct way that the high IQ Homer can express things that the crayon Homer cannot. It tells her that even if she cannot always reach him, the love is there. That underneath the impairment, underneath the fog, underneath everything the crayon has done to the distance between them, the love is real and it is hers. Lisa reads the note and cries. And this is, I think, one of the most structurally devastating moments in the show's run. Because it is the show admitting, directly and without comedy, that the father Lisa has always deserved exists. He is in there. He has always been in there, behind the crayon, behind the radiation, behind everything that Springfield and its plant and Burns's deliberate negligence have done to the man who is supposed to be raising her. The father she needs exists. She just cannot reach him, and he cannot reach her, and the note is the closest they will ever get to the conversation they should have been able to have her whole life. That note is Homer's letter from the other side of the crayon to the daughter he cannot be fully present for. It is the show's clearest acknowledgement of what has been taken from this family, not by dramatic villainy, by the quiet, grinding, institutional management of a man's capacity, by keeping him just functional enough to maintain his position, and just limited enough to never threaten the position of anyone above him. The crayon is the most devastating character detail in the show's history, and it is set in season 12, in an episode whose premise sounds like a throwaway comedy conceit. The show has always done this, hidden the most serious things inside the least serious containers. Section 5. The Coma That Ate Springfield. On the 1st of April 1993, the 14th episode of the 4th season of The Simpsons aired on Fox. The episode was titled, So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. It is, in the meta-category sense, a clip show and episode composed largely of footage from previous episodes, framed by a new narrative. These were common in the early 1990s, a way for television productions to stretch a season without spending a full episode budget. The Simpsons did several of them in its early run, but the frame of this particular clip show is unusual. The episode's inciting event is that Bart, as an April Fool's Day prank, shakes a can of Homer's beer so intensely that when Homer opens it, the pressurized contents knock him across the room with enough force to put him into a coma. Homer lies in a hospital bed, unconscious, for the duration of the episode. The clip show unfolds as a series of memories, presumably from Homer's comatose mind. At the end of the episode, Homer wakes up. He crushes Bart's hand. Everything is fine. Except, and here is the thing, according to a significant body of fan analysis, Homer never actually woke up. The coma theory is one of the oldest and most structurally coherent fan theories about The Simpsons, and I want to give it the careful treatment it deserves rather than the brief mention it usually gets. The proposition is this: the Homer Simpson who wakes up at the end of So It's Come to This is not actually waking up. He is not recovering from his coma. He is entering a deeper level of the coma, the level where dreams feel entirely real, where the dreamer has no awareness of their condition, where the internal narrative of the dream has its own complete and self-consistent logic. Everything that follows in the show after the 1st of April 1993, every episode from season 5 forward, everything we call the later Simpsons, is the content of Homer's coma dream. This is not a frivolous theory. Let me explain why. The tonal shift in The Simpsons is something that viewers noticed in real time. The show's first 4 seasons have a particular quality, grounded, specific, emotionally layered, with a realism about working-class American life that the show balanced against its comedy without abandoning. The characters have inner lives. The plots are human scale. The Springfield that exists in seasons 1 through 4 is recognizable as a real American town, heightened for comedy but not fundamentally distorted. Beginning roughly in season 5 and accelerating noticeably in seasons 6, 7, and beyond, something changes. The changes are not uniform, and there are extraordinary individual episodes scattered throughout the later seasons. But the direction of travel is consistent. The show becomes less grounded. The plots become more extravagant. Homer becomes less a recognizable human being and more a chaos principle in cartoon form. Springfield begins to drift from a recognizable American town towards something more like a dreamscape, a place governed by internal associations rather than external logic, where cause and effect operate on a cartoon's terms rather than a realist's. Celebrity cameos increase dramatically. In seasons 1 through 4, guest stars are relatively rare and are integrated with some care into the show's world. Beginning in season 5, celebrities appear with increasing frequency, and they begin to appear as themselves as celebrities stepping into Springfield rather than as characters Springfield might plausibly contain. The show's relationship with fame changes. Springfield becomes a place where the famous world intersects with the ordinary world, which is a different premise than the show started with. The passage of time becomes incoherent. Seasons 1 through 4 maintain a loose but recognizable temporal logic. Events follow from each other. Characters remember things that happened in previous episodes. The timeline, while not rigorously continuous, has the feeling of a world that moves forward in time. Beginning in Season 5, the temporal logic collapses. Characters have backstories that contradict earlier backstories. Events that were established as happening a certain number of years ago are later placed at different times. The show's history becomes fluid in a way that it previously was not. And perhaps most tellingly, Homer changes. The Homer of Season 1 through 4 is a specific person. He is a man with a particular relationship to his work, his family, his body, his ambitions. He fails in ways that are recognizable and even painful. His love for his family is expressed through actions that are imperfect but consistent with who he is. He is, in other words, a character, someone whose behavior follows from an inner life that the show has established and maintained. The Homer of Season 5 and beyond, particularly as the show progresses through Seasons 7, 8, 9, and beyond, becomes progressively less like a character and more like a premise. He can be placed in any situation. His personality adjusts to serve the needs of the plot. His relationship to his past is inconsistent. His relationship to his family becomes a tone that can be invoked when the story needs heart, rather than a specific dynamic that follows from who he and Marge and the children actually are. This is the change that the coma theory explains with unusual precision. Because what would a coma dream look like? It would look like someone trying to reconstruct their ordinary life from within a state of unconscious processing. It would have the broad shapes, right? The family, the house, the job, the town, because those are the shapes that are deepest in the dreamer's memory. But the details would drift. The logic would loosen. The rules of the world would become more flexible because the subconscious mind does not enforce rules the way waking consciousness does. People would become more archetypal and less specific. Events would become more associative, linked by feeling and theme rather than by cause and effect. The dream would know what everything is supposed to mean, in the deepest sense, but it would be less reliable about the precise form those meanings take. That is exactly what the later Simpsons is. The family is there. The love is there, in the broad and sincere sense. Springfield is there. The plant is there. But the specificity has loosened. The rules have relaxed. The people have become types of themselves rather than themselves. And the events are governed by a logic that is more associative, more dreamlike, than the logic of the first 4 seasons. There is also a specific piece of canonical evidence for the coma theory that is rarely mentioned. In the Season 4 finale, the episode that aired just before the clip show in which Homer enters his coma, there is a moment in which Homer has a dream sequence. The dream sequence has a particular visual quality, a looseness and a strangeness that marks it as distinct from the show's normal register. And several fans have noted that the visual quality of that dream sequence, its color palette, its logic, its relationship to physical reality, closely resembles the visual quality of the Season 5 premiere. As if the show's own visual grammar acknowledged what was happening. That may be coincidence. In a show produced by many people over many years, coincidences happen. But it is a curious coincidence, the kind that, once you notice it, makes it difficult to not notice it. Let us sit with what the coma theory would mean for a few specific later season storylines. Homer's increasingly improbable adventures, the episodes in which he becomes a boxer, a grease entrepreneur, a country music songwriter, a food critic, a snowplow operator, a missionary. All of these are episodes that critics have identified as symptoms of Homerization, the process by which Homer became the vehicle for any plot the show wanted to tell, regardless of whether it was consistent with his character. In a coma dream, these episodes make perfect sense. A dreaming mind puts itself at the center of every fantasy. Homer's coma dream puts him at the center of every possible version of a life. He is, in his dream, all the things he never got to be. The celebrity appearances also make sense as dream logic. Famous people appear in dreams all the time. They appear because the dreaming mind has absorbed their images from the culture and integrated them into its own narrative. Celebrity guest appearances that break the fourth wall, that have the celebrities appearing as simplified versions of their public personas rather than as characters. These are exactly what you would expect from a mind building, a world from cultural fragments. The increasingly loose relationship to time and continuity, the way that Homer's backstory shifts, the way that character histories contract and expand, this is the dream's internal consistency, failing at the edges. The broad shapes hold. Homer grew up in Springfield, married Marge, had 3 children. But the specifics are less reliable because the dreaming mind reconstructs rather than remembers, and reconstruction inevitably introduces errors and distortions. And the show's growing awareness of itself, the meta-commentary, the fourth wall breaks, the episodes about the show's own longevity and declining quality, these are moments where Homer's dreaming mind bumps against the limits of its own construction. Moments where the dream develops a kind of flicker at the edges, where the internal logic cannot quite contain what the dreaming mind is trying to tell itself. There is a Season 8 episode, You Only Move Twice, which is by almost universal agreement one of the greatest individual episodes in the show's history. In it, Homer gets a new job with a charismatic new employer named Hank Scorpio, who turns out to be a supervillain engaged in world domination. Homer helps Scorpio achieve his goals without fully understanding that he is doing so. At the end, Homer gets the thing he wanted, a professional football team, but it is the Denver Broncos, which is not the team he wanted, and he is devastated. Under the coma theory, this episode is Homer dreaming about the life he deserved. A life with a good boss who values him. A life where his contributions matter. A life where he is capable and effective and appreciated. The supervillain detail is the dream's mechanism for making the wish darker than wish fulfillment, the subconscious inserting its own ambivalence, its own awareness that the perfect boss comes with a price. And the ending where Homer gets something but not the specific thing he wanted is the dream's honesty about the way things usually work. You Only Move Twice is inside the coma theory, Homer's subconscious producing one of the most precise and self-aware things it ever produces. A dream about professional fulfillment that knows enough about the dreamer to understand that the fulfillment would be complicated. Now, I am not arguing that the coma theory is literally true in any authorial sense. The writers of The Simpsons did not sit down and decide to turn the show into a coma narrative. The changes from Season 4 to Season 5 were the result of creative personnel changes, the maturing of a show finding its footing in celebrity culture, the natural drift of a production that has to generate 22 episodes a year for decades. What I am arguing is that the coma theory describes something real about what happened to the show, that the shift it identifies is genuine, that the dreamlike quality of the later seasons is a quality the show actually has, and that the theory is a more honest account of what changed than the simple narrative about declining quality. The coma theory does not say the later seasons are bad. It says they are different in kind from the earlier ones. It says they are operating on a different logic, and that is true. Whether Homer is literally dreaming or the show is simply dreaming on his behalf, whether this is internal fiction or external craft drift, the result is the same. After the 1st of April 1993, The Simpsons became a different show. A show that felt like something half-remembered. A show that knew its broad shapes and held them faithfully while the fine details drifted and loosened, and became the stuff of reverie rather than observation. A show that is, in the most literal sense available to a cartoon, dreaming, and we keep watching. Which means, in some sense, that we are participating in the dream. We are the ones keeping Homer company in his coma. We are the ones pressing play year after year, ensuring that the dream continues, that Springfield persists, that the family stays in amber and keeps going through the motions of a life that is, at its foundation, a reconstruction of something that ended one April morning in 1993. The show keeps going because we keep watching. And we keep watching because somewhere in us, there is something that the dream is meeting. We will come back to what that something might be. But before we leave the coma, there is one detail the theory produces that I find harder to shake than any of the others. If Homer is dreaming, and if his dream is the 40-plus years of Springfield we have watched, then the dream is remarkably benevolent for something generated by a brain losing function. The dream is not a nightmare. There is grief in it. The episodes that hit hardest, the ones that produce the genuinely moving moments, are grief in disguise. Homer discovering his mother. Homer sitting with his father in the rare moments when the distance between them closes. Homer watching his children be remarkable in ways he cannot fully articulate or even always perceive. These are the grief moments. The moments where the dream knows what it has lost, but the predominant register of the dream is warmth. The family comes home. The crises resolve. The absurdity is funny rather than terrifying. Springfield is dangerous in specific documented ways, but it is also, consistently, a place where people know each other, help each other in bizarre ways, and share a community that functions, however dysfunctionally, as a community. A man in a coma in Springfield General, in a hospital bed he has been in for 30 years, has spent 30 years dreaming about a world with warmth in it. That is either the saddest thing or the sweetest thing in the entire show. I have been thinking about it for a while and I have not decided which. Let me give you one more thing to think about before we leave the coma theory behind. If Homer has been dreaming since April 1993, then every other character in the show after that date exists only inside Homer's head. Marge is not Marge, she is Homer's idea of Marge, reconstructed from memory, shaped by love and longing, and the specific way that the last conscious image of a person becomes the definitive version of them in the mind that holds them. The Marge of Season 5 and beyond is the Marge that Homer was afraid of losing, held in the exact shape she had on the day he went under. Which means Marge is, in some sense, Homer's most complete act of devotion. He has been keeping her, building her every episode, maintaining her with the resources of an unconscious mind that is slowly running out of them. The blue hair that defies physics, the worried eyes, the specific combination of patience and frustration and love that defines her. Homer built all of that. Homer has been sustaining all of that for 32 years. And the same is true of the children. Bart at 10, perpetually. Lisa at 8, always. Maggie at 1, forever reaching. Homer's dreaming mind cannot age them, because aging requires information. Homer does not have. He does not know what an older Bart looks like, what an older Lisa sounds like, what Maggie becomes when she grows into whatever she is becoming. He only knows them as they were when the vending machine fell. So he keeps them there, he keeps them young. He keeps them exactly as they were on the morning of the 1st of April 1993, when he last had access to the waking world and its contents. The floating timeline is Homer's love, made structural. His refusal to let go encoded into the architecture of the dream itself. Every episode where nobody ages is Homer insisting on the last version of his family he ever actually saw. Every episode where Maggie is still a baby is Homer holding his youngest child in the only arms available to him, the arms of an unconscious mind in a hospital bed in Springfield General. It is the saddest thing. It is also, in its own damaged and involuntary way, one of the most complete acts of love in the history of American television. Section 6. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The summer of 1995 was the last time a primetime animated television show made all of America argue about a fictional crime. Fox promoted it like a cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special. Newspapers ran speculation pieces. Schoolyards debated it. The internet, which was young and strange and not yet the engine it would become, hosted early newsgroup discussions where users who had access to it posted guesses and traded theories. There was a national contest. Send in your answer, and if you got it right, you would be animated into a future episode of the show. Nobody won. That is the detail that almost always gets lost when people discuss the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline. The contest was built on the premise that the answer was solvable from the evidence in the Part 1 episode. The show's creators told the public, everything you need to figure this out is in the episode. Watch carefully. The clues are there. And then when Part 2 aired and the answer was revealed, the contest administrators examined the entries and found that essentially nobody in the randomly sampled pool of submissions had gotten it right. The answer was not, in the way the show claimed, solvable from the evidence provided. Either the clues were insufficient, the red herrings too effective, or the answer did not follow logically from what was on screen. There is one person, documented in the show's own DVD commentary, who posted the correct answer to a Simpsons newsgroup on the night the Part 1 episode aired. One person, out of the entire viewing public, who worked it out. And by the time the contest concluded and the producers tried to reach them, their college internet account was no longer active. They could not be found. The one person who genuinely solved the mystery essentially vanished. The show issued an invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward. As far as anyone knows, they never did. Let us think about that for a moment. The mystery was designed to be solvable. One person solved it. That person cannot be found. And the answer that emerged from the official resolution of the storyline was an answer that the contest's own outcome suggested did not logically follow from the available evidence. That is a strange foundation for a settled case. Now, let us look at what we actually know about the shooting. Montgomery Burns. At the climax of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1 has done everything in his power to make every single person in Springfield want him dead. He has drained an oil well from beneath the school, eliminating the budget for music and other programs. He has constructed a sun-blocking device that plunges Springfield into permanent artificial night in order to force residents to purchase electricity exclusively from his plant. He has fired Smithers. He has, in the course of these actions, directly harmed the financial interests and personal lives of dozens of identified characters. At the town meeting convened to confront him, Burns is present and defiant. Weapons are visible on at least several audience members. The scene builds to a confrontation, and then Burns leaves. Sometime in the next few minutes, in a location near the town hall, Burns is shot with his own gun and staggers to the town's sundial, where he collapses. His hands fall across two letters, W and S. From his perspective, facing outward, the letters would read M and S. When Part 2 airs 3 months later, the investigation resolves on Maggie. Burns woke from his coma, and he identified baby Maggie as his assailant. According to his account, he encountered her in the parking lot, attempted to take her lollipop, and during the struggle his gun fell from his holster. Maggie picked it up. It discharged. Burns was shot. Chief Wiggum closes the case on the grounds that no jury would convict an infant. End of mystery. Except, let us examine the specific evidence problems because there are several. The sundial. Burns's own testimony, delivered in the resolution episode, is that his hands landing on those specific letters was not intentional. He did not position himself to leave a clue. He simply fell, and his hands landed where they landed. The show's own victim explicitly says that the central piece of physical evidence, the clue the audience spent a summer analyzing, is meaningless. Burns did not point at MS to tell us something. He collapsed, and coincidence did the rest. If the sundial clue is meaningless, as Burns states, then the foundational structure of the mystery, the thing the contest told us to analyze, tells us nothing. The show designed a mystery around a piece of evidence that the mystery's own resolution dismisses as accidental. The gun. Burns carried a personal firearm in a holster. At some point before the shooting, the holster is visible and empty. The gun was taken from Burns before the encounter in the parking lot. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, which means the shooter either pickpocketed Burns at the town meeting or encountered the gun after Burns dropped or set it down somewhere. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. So does anyone else who was in the area without their own weapon. Burns's last words before being shot. "Oh, it's you. This is important." He recognized his assailant. He was not surprised. He said, "It's you," the way you say it to someone you know, not to someone you are afraid of, not to someone unexpected, but to someone whose presence registers as familiar. Does Burns know Maggie? Has he ever interacted with her in any meaningful way prior to this episode? The show does not establish this. Burns has difficulty remembering Homer's name after decades of employment, but he immediately recognizes Homer's 1-year-old daughter. The "it's you" fits several other characters much more naturally. It fits Homer, whose face Burns presumably knows despite never remembering his name. It fits Smithers, whom Burns fired that day, and who would have been the most expected person to find Burns alone in a parking lot. It fits Marge, with whom Burns had an established interaction in a previous episode in which he became infatuated with her. Any of these characters would produce a more natural "oh, it's you" than a baby Burns has never had a meaningful conversation with. In Season 18, Homer confesses to shooting Burns. He says it directly, on camera. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The show treats Homer's confession as a throwaway moment, something said and forgotten, which is either lazy writing Homer saying something crazy that the show discards or a planted detail. A piece of information left sitting in the show's canon for anyone who wants to find it. If Homer did it, the evidence that convicted Maggie falls apart. The DNA eyelash that pointed to a Simpson becomes Homer's, not Maggie's. Burns's "oh, it's you" is Homer's employer recognizing him. The parking lot becomes a place where Homer, distraught after yet another year of Burns not knowing his name, finally snapped. And the most efficient path to concealing Homer's guilt is to find a suspect who cannot be prosecuted, a baby who cannot be convicted, whose presence at the scene can be established, whose finding of a gun can be made plausible. The case closes. The real shooter walks free. The baby takes the fall that cannot hurt a baby. But then there is Marge. The Marge theory is in some ways the most emotionally coherent. Marge has watched Burns destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, drive a wedge between Homer's job and his dignity for years, and steal the literal sun from her family's daily life. Marge is not a passive character. Marge has, in multiple episodes, demonstrated a capacity for decisive and even dangerous action when her family is threatened. She is someone capable of doing something that others would not expect from her. And Burns was infatuated with Marge. This Is Canon, a Season 4 episode, establishes that Burns fell, briefly and intensely, for Marge when she worked at the plant. If Burns was shot by Marge, his decision not to name her in his recovered testimony makes a different kind of emotional sense. Not because he is protecting her strategically, but because he is protecting her personally. He would not send Marge Simpson to prison. He would rather lie. And so he wakes up, and he looks around the hospital room, and Maggie is there, because of course Maggie is there. The whole family is at the bedside, and Burns looks at the baby and says, with perfect poker-face deliberateness, that the baby did it. Knowing that no jury would convict a baby, making the problem disappear in the most elegant way available to a man who just woke up from a coma with a bullet wound and an inconvenient memory. The alternate endings exist. A fully produced and voiced Smithers ending was animated and screened in the 138th episode Spectacular, then dismissed as incorrect on the grounds that it would require ignoring the DNA evidence. An early script draft had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered multiple candidates before landing on Maggie, which means the answer was not predetermined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers chose. The mystery was reverse engineered. This is not a criticism of the show. Reverse engineering mysteries is common in serialized fiction. The writers did not know who shot Burns when they wrote Part 1. They built the investigation in Part 2 around whatever answer they eventually chose. The clues in Part 1 were planted retroactively in editing and production, but some of them were planted less firmly than the contest suggested. What it means is this. The official answer to the greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not arrived at by the characters finding the truth. It was arrived at by the production finding a convenient conclusion. And the difference between truth-finding and convenient conclusion finding is the entire moral of the Who Shot Mr. Burns story, if you are willing to see it that way. Springfield did not solve the Burns shooting. Springfield closed it. And in Springfield, as we will discuss at length when we come to the Armin Tamzarian episode, those are two very different things. The case was closed because it needed to be closed. The baby was named because the baby was the cleanest solution. Maggie cannot confess. Maggie cannot protest. Maggie cannot, even at the end of the resolution episode when she is alone in a room and performs a trigger-pulling gesture with her pacifier, tell us whether she is confessing or imitating something she saw someone else do. That ambiguity is the show's last and most honest gesture about the mystery. Maggie's final gesture does not confirm guilt. It confirms memory. She is remembering something. Whether she is remembering pulling a trigger or watching someone else pull one, that is the question the show will never answer, because Springfield's settled cases do not permit that kind of re-examination. The mystery of who shot Mr. Burns was never really solved. It was closed. And the file, in the deep organizational logic of Springfield, is sealed. But there is a detail about the case that the show embedded so subtly that it almost always goes unmentioned in discussions of the mystery. In the episode that preceded Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1 by several episodes deep, in Season 6 Burns is shown acquiring Homer's name in a notable moment. He finally learns it. He writes it on his hand. He looks at it carefully. Homer, who is present for this moment, is visibly moved. And then, in subsequent appearances within that same stretch of episodes, Burns forgets it again. He writes it on his hand, looks at it, and forgets it. The man whose name Burns cannot retain is the man who had the clearest motive to shoot him. The man whose eyelash was found on Burns's suit. The man who later, in Season 18, told the camera he had shot Burns. If you were designing a case in which one person was guilty and another person was made to take the blame, you would want the actual guilty party to be so invisible to the victim that the victim's own testimony would not name them. You would want someone the victim recognizes, but cannot place with precision, someone about whom the victim can say, instinctively, "Oh, it's you?" without having the name or the context to fill in the rest. Homer Simpson to Mr. Burns is a face without a name, a familiar presence without a clear identity. The man Burns cannot remember is the man Burns cannot testify against, because testifying against someone requires being able to say who they are. In that reading, Homer's lifelong invisibility to his own employer is not a running gag. It is, in the specific context of the shooting investigation, a structural alibi. There is one more dimension to the Burns shooting that almost never appears in discussions of it, and which I think is the most uncomfortable implication of the whole storyline. The episode ends with Maggie taking the blame. Chief Wiggum declares the case closed. Burns is alive. Justice is served in the form of no justice at all, and the town moves on. But consider what the town moving on actually required. It required every adult in Springfield who had a motive, who was at the meeting, who was in the vicinity that night, to simply decline to correct the record, to watch a baby be named as the shooter and choose not to say anything. Smithers, who knows Burns better than anyone, stayed silent. Homer, who had motive and whose DNA was on the gun, stayed silent. Every other person who could have offered alternative evidence or testimony stayed silent. The closing of the Burns case required the collective cooperation of an entire town. Everyone agreed, without discussing it, not to complicate the convenient answer. This is not cynicism about the characters. This is the observation that in a town like Springfield, where the collective decision to maintain comfortable fictions is the primary social technology, the Burns investigation was never going to produce a different outcome. The shooting of Burns threatened the stability of the town's most important institution. A real investigation, one that followed evidence wherever it led, might have produced a conviction that destabilized the plant, triggered lawsuits, invited federal scrutiny that Springfield desperately needed to avoid. Maggie as the answer was not just legally clean, it was institutionally safe. Springfield's most powerful and dangerous secret was almost exposed by a gunshot. And Springfield protected itself by giving the case the only answer that could close it without opening anything else. The mystery was never really solved. The mystery was managed. And in that management, every person in Springfield became, briefly and without discussion, an accessory to the same cover-up. They have been keeping that secret ever since. Every episode that has aired after the resolution of that storyline is set in a town where everyone knows, at some level, that the official answer was the convenient answer. And nobody says anything. Because in Springfield, you do not say anything. You vote to forget, and the vote always passes. Let me leave you with one final observation about the Burns shooting that I think is the most troubling of all. The show spent 2 full episodes, a season finale, and a season premiere constructing the most elaborate mystery in its history. It ran a national contest. It generated more cultural conversation than almost any other storyline in the show's entire run. It made the question of who shot Burns into something genuinely shared millions of people arguing about a fictional crime with the intensity usually reserved for things that actually matter. And then it solved the mystery with an answer that the victim himself said was arrived at by coincidence, in testimony delivered by a man who had just woken up from a coma with a bullet wound in him. And everyone accepted it, not because the evidence was airtight, not because the investigation was thorough, because the answer was convenient, and because accepting it allowed everyone to move on. The national conversation ended. The contest was concluded. The file was closed. This is the show at its most precise about something it rarely states directly. The energy that Americans bring to the question of accountability, the genuine, collective, excited engagement with the process of finding out who did something wrong, dissipates the moment a convenient answer becomes available. Not necessarily the right answer. A convenient one, an answer that closes the loop, an answer that lets everyone return to their lives. Burns was shot, someone did it, Maggie did it, case closed. We are the jury that convicted the baby, and we moved on. Section 7. The Immortal Billionaire. Charles Montgomery Plantagenet Schicklgruber Burns was born, according to various canonical references scattered across the show's run, somewhere in the late 19th century. The precise year varies by episode. The show has never committed to a specific birth date, which is itself a choice worth examining, but the range of confirmed historical references places his birth somewhere between 1000 1,881, and 1,898. If you take the conservative end of that range, Burns is, as of the show's current episodes, approximately 128 years old. If you take the middle of the range, he is somewhere around 135. He is, in other words, not just old. He is impossible. He is alive at an age that no human being has reached in recorded history with documented evidence. And unlike the various individuals who have claimed extreme longevity across history, Burns is not just alive, he is functional. He runs a corporation. He navigates municipal politics. He executes multi-stage plans that require sustained strategic intelligence. His mind, whatever has happened to his body, is sharp in a way that no amount of ordinary genetic luck or clean living would explain. So how is Burns still alive? And how does the show explain it, in the ways it chooses to address the question at all? The most direct canonical answer comes in the Springfield Files, the Season 8 episode in which Homer encounters what he believes is an alien in the woods near Springfield. The FBI is called in, and the eventual reveal is that the alien is Mr. Burns. Burns, it turns out, undergoes weekly medical treatments of such intensity that the chemical and radiation load they place on his body causes him to emit a faint but visible green glow. The treatments keep him alive. Without them, his body would simply cease to function. The show presents this as a punchline. The alien mystery is deflated into a gag about an old man's medical maintenance. The audience laughs and moves on. But the implication, if you hold it for a moment without letting the laugh carry you past it, is extraordinary. Burns is not surviving through any natural biological process. He is not exceptionally healthy. He is not living proof that some people are simply constitutionally built for longevity. He is being kept alive by an intervention that has to be administered on a precise weekly schedule that involves levels of radiation and chemical input that would be acutely dangerous to a normal person, and whose effect on his body is so total that it causes visible light emission. Burns's body is maintained. It does not sustain itself. It is serviced, on a regular schedule, the way a machine is serviced. His life is a managed equilibrium of inputs and outputs, calibrated with enough precision that missing a single weekly treatment would be fatal. The margin for error is zero. Now consider what this means alongside the Three Stooges syndrome scene, one of the most quoted and beloved moments in the show's medical canon. Burns visits a doctor who delivers the news that he has every disease known to medical science simultaneously. Every single one. All present in his body at the same time, at relatively balanced levels, which means that every disease that should kill him is being blocked by every other disease that should kill him. The doorway is so crowded that nothing can get through. The doctor calls this a unique phenomenon. The comedy comes from the absurdity of it, the idea that having every illness makes you, paradoxically, indestructible. The audience laughs. But if you connect the Three Stooges syndrome to the weekly treatments, the picture that emerges is not absurd. It is logical. Burns does not have perfect equilibrium among his diseases by accident. The weekly treatments are maintaining that equilibrium. The radiation inputs, the chemical cocktails, the medical interventions that Smithers arranges every week, they are the mechanism that keeps every disease perfectly balanced against every other disease. They are doing, artificially and deliberately, what no human immune system could do naturally. Burns's medical regimen is not keeping him alive despite his illnesses. It is using his illnesses as the maintenance system for his survival. His body has become a kind of biological reactor, and his weekly treatments are the process of adjusting the control rods. Too much of one thing and a disease escapes stasis and kills him. Too little of another and a different disease takes advantage and kills him. The balance is everything. And maintaining the balance, week after week, for what the show implies is many decades, requires exactly the kind of logistical competence and institutional memory that one person provides. Smithers, Wayland Smithers Jr., is the most essential employee at the Springfield nuclear power plant, and not because of anything he does for the plant itself. Smithers is essential because Smithers is the only person in Burns's orbit who fully understands the medical protocol, who knows the schedule, who arranges the treatments, who monitors Burns's condition between appointments, who would notice, in a way that nobody else would notice, if something in the equilibrium were beginning to shift. The show has depicted on multiple occasions what happens when Smithers is absent from Burns's life. Burns becomes helpless in ways that go beyond emotional dependence. He cannot manage his environment. He cannot make basic daily decisions. He loses the thread of his own plans. These symptoms are played as comedy, the powerful man revealed to be dependent on his assistant, but they are also, under the framework of what we know about Burns's medical situation, something more frightening. Burns without Smithers is Burns without his maintenance manager, a man whose biological survival depends on a weekly intervention, left without the person who schedules and executes that intervention. Every day Smithers is absent is a day closer to a missed treatment. And a missed treatment, the show has told us, means Burns dies within the week. Smithers' devotion to Burns is therefore not, in this reading, purely emotional. It is existential. If Burns dies, Smithers loses the thing that defines his life. But the reverse is also true. If Smithers leaves, Burns dies. The dependency is mutual in a way that the show rarely acknowledges. Directly, Burns is as captive to Smithers as Smithers is to Burns, because Smithers holds the knowledge that keeps the machine running. This is a very strange relationship to have built into the comedic infrastructure of a primetime cartoon, and the show has maintained it for 36 years without quite allowing it to fully resolve into the thing it actually is. Now, let us talk about Burns's history. Because Burns's personal history, as the show has depicted it across dozens of episodes, is one of the most detailed and bizarre character backstories in American television. Burns attended Yale. He has referenced personal memories of the First World War. He served in some capacity during the Second World War, in a role the show has depicted as morally questionable. At several points, there is a canonical episode in which it is revealed that Burns stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war, which he then kept hidden for decades, which is the kind of detail that raises considerable questions about what else Burns has done in the course of a century of financially motivated operation. He knew Howard Hughes personally, according to a Season 3 reference. He has described attending events in the early 20th century, things like early baseball games, early aviation demonstrations, historical moments from the first few decades of the 1900s, not as historical curiosities someone told him about, but as experiences he was present for. He references the Spanish-American War as something that happened within his own lifetime, not as history, as memory. And all of this is delivered by the show in a register that sits between comedy and horror. Burns's age is the source of jokes about his physical frailty, his unfamiliarity with modern technology, his inability to recognize references that postdate 1920. But underneath the comedy is the structural fact of a man who has been alive and active and accumulating power for longer than any of the institutions that are supposed to hold him accountable. Longer than the regulations governing his plant, longer than the careers of every regulatory official who has ever been assigned to oversee him, longer than the political careers of the politicians who are supposed to represent the interests of Springfield's residents against his. Burns has simply outlasted accountability. He has been around long enough that the knowledge of what he has done, the things he got away with before anyone was paying attention, the deals he made in eras when the deals he was making were not yet illegal, the people he influenced or compromised or simply waited out, has become diffuse and unverifiable. You cannot prosecute a man for things he did in 1923 when none of the witnesses are alive. You cannot reverse arrangements that were made in 1955 when the paper trail is held in a corporation whose records Burns controls. Burns's longevity is his immunity. Every year he continues to exist is another year of diluted accountability. Another year of witnesses dying and records becoming inaccessible and institutional memories fading. The passage of time, which should be Burns's enemy given that it is inexorably consuming his physical body, is actually his greatest protection, because time destroys accountability much faster than it destroys a man who can afford the treatments to slow its biological effects. There is one more angle on Burns's immortality that the show touches without quite examining. The Burns family, as the show depicts it, is an old American dynasty, old money. The kind of wealth that predates most American institutions and was built in eras when the methods of building it were not subject to the moral scrutiny we would now apply. Burns did not create his fortune. He inherited a fortune that was already ancient by the time he was born. He is the latest iteration of a dynastic project that has been running for much longer than he personally has been alive, which raises a question the show has never directly addressed. Was Burns always the last of his line? Has every previous generation of Burns found ways to extend their grip on wealth and power past their natural biological limits? Is there something in the Burns dynasty, some knowledge, some resource, some technique that has allowed it to persist across generations in ways that ordinary family fortunes do not? The show does not say. It cannot say, because saying it would require the show to take Burns fully seriously as a horror rather than a comedy character, and the show has always maintained enough tonal balance to keep him in the comedic lane. But the implication is there, sitting in the background of every Burns episode, in the references to his age and his history and the longevity of his family's control over Springfield's resources. Burns is not just old, Burns is a dynasty in one body. He is the accumulated power and knowledge of a family project that has been running for longer than most of the oversight systems designed to constrain it. And his weekly medical treatments are simply the latest mechanism in a long history of mechanisms designed to ensure that the project continues. Springfield needs the plant needs Burns. Burns needs the treatments need Smithers. Smithers needs the job is the plant, the loop is closed, the system is self-sustaining. And at its center, kept alive by controlled radiation and the logistical competence of a devoted assistant, is a man who remembers the Spanish-American War and has not yet decided when to retire. He won't retire. He can't die. He's too expensive. And Springfield will keep paying the bill. It will keep paying in contaminated water and suppressed cognitive function and the slow biological taxation of living in the shadow of those cooling towers. It will keep paying in the children who grow up yellow and four-fingered and vaguely, persistently unwell, in ways that the Springfield medical establishment, which is also, in its own quiet way, in Burns's orbit will never quite document with enough precision to matter legally. The bill is paid in the currency of health. Burns cashes it in the currency of years, and the exchange rate from Springfield's perspective has never been favorable. Let me give you one more angle on Burns before we move on, because I think there is something about him that the show has been depicting for 36 years and that almost nobody has named directly. Burns is lonely, not in a sympathetic way that would soften the account of everything he has done, not in a way that mitigates any of it, but in the specific, observable way that someone is lonely when they have outlived every peer, every contemporary, every person who was formed by the same historical moment as they were. Burns is from the 19th century. He carries the values, the aesthetic preferences, the assumptions about power and class and entitlement that were the furniture of a specific world that ceased to exist sometime around 1945. The 20th century happened without him in any meaningful sense. The 21st has been entirely alien. He moves through Springfield like a man visiting from a country that no longer exists, performing the behaviors appropriate to a context that the rest of the world dissolved long ago. His relationship with Smithers, whatever else it is his only genuine ongoing relationship. His interactions with the wider world are transactional, strategic, or contemptuous. He has no friends. He has employees, subordinates, political allies, and enemies. The distinction between allies and enemies is, for Burns, largely one of temporary alignment, and Smithers, who manages his medical protocol, and his schedule, and his daily life, and who is the one person who sees Burns clearly enough to understand what keeping him alive actually requires? Smithers is the only person Burns is in any sense. Close to. Which means that the closest thing Burns has to friendship is a relationship defined by absolute power differential, by economic dependency, and by the specific knowledge that Smithers's professional existence is the mechanism of Burns's physical survival. That is the closest Burns has to love. And Burns, who has been alive long enough to have had other things, must know the difference. In the episodes where Smithers leaves, where the relationship cracks and Smithers attempts to build a life not organized around Burns, the show depicts something interesting in Burns. Not grief, exactly, but a specific kind of disorientation, a man who cannot locate himself without his primary reference point, a man who, stripped of the one relationship that structures his daily existence, becomes something close to helpless. This is played as comedy, the all-powerful billionaire unable to function without his assistant. The gag writes itself. But under the theory of Burns as a man in the late stages of an impossibly long life, the disorientation reads as something more specific. Burns is not just dependent on Smithers logistically. He is dependent on Smithers for the experience of being in relation to another person, for the daily proof that he still occupies a world that contains someone else. The loneliness of a man who has lived for 130 years and watched everyone who ever knew him disappear is not a comic premise. It is, if you look at it without the comedy register, one of the saddest things in the show. Burns has made himself into something that cannot die, and in doing so has ensured that everything around him can. He has survived his world, he has outlasted his century, and he is left standing in a town he has poisoned, dependent on a man he cannot admit to needing, running a corporation that operates as the principal engine of everything wrong with the place he is unable to leave. He is too old to start over, too invested to walk away, too alive, because of the treatments, to have the release that would end this. Burns is trapped in Springfield just as surely as Homer is. The mechanisms are different. The resources available to each of them are different by a factor of several $billion. But the trap is the same trap. The town has them both, and the town does not let go. Section 8. Maggie's Secret. Maggie Simpson does not talk. This is a fact about the character that the show has maintained with unusual consistency across 36 years. She has said individual words on a small number of occasions. Her first word, Daddy, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a Season 3 episode, is the most famous example. There have been a few other moments, in dream sequences or flash-forward episodes or non-canonical settings where Maggie speaks. But in the main text of the show, across hundreds of canonical episodes, Maggie is silent. She communicates through gestures and expressions and the occasional emphatic movement of her pacifier, but she does not speak. The standard reading of this silence is developmental. Maggie is a baby. Babies don't talk. The show's commitment to not aging its characters means Maggie is permanently in the pre-verbal stage of development, and the show has maintained that detail faithfully because anything else would require acknowledging that time has passed. That is the obvious reading. It is probably the correct intentional reading, in the sense that the show's creators almost certainly made this choice for this reason. But intentionality, as we have established, is not always the most interesting frame for analyzing what a story actually does. And what Maggie's silence actually does, inside the logic of 36 years of a show about a specific family, is create something that functions less like a character trait and more like a deliberate strategy. Consider what Maggie has accomplished. She shot a man. Whether the full truth of the Burns shooting is what the show officially claims or something more complex, what is established is that Maggie was present at a shooting. Maggie was identified as the person who fired the gun, and Maggie was never prosecuted because the criminal justice system has no mechanism for holding an infant accountable. Whatever she did or did not do, she did it in a way that made the legal consequences zero. The most protected possible position in which to commit an act of violence is to be a person the law does not know how to deal with. She led a daycare rebellion. The theatrical short film The Longest Daycare, 7 minutes of Maggie navigating an authoritarian childcare facility to protect a caterpillar, is not a comedy film about a baby doing funny things. It is, if you watch it carefully, a film about a tactician. Maggie reads her environment in that film. She identifies the power structures, the vulnerabilities, the windows of opportunity. She executes a plan that requires timing and spatial reasoning and the ability to anticipate how other actors in the system will respond to her moves. She does all of this without speaking a word, and she does it while operating within the physical limitations of a 1-year-old body that cannot reliably walk without falling. Her cognitive capacity is not impaired. Her physical capacity is. The gap between what her mind can do and what her body can do is the central dramatic tension of every Maggie storyline, and it is a tension she navigates with a consistency that implies experience. The experience of having done this before, of having learned the specific ways in which her physical limitations can be worked around. There are episodes in which Maggie's intelligence is explicitly tested and found to be extraordinary. The show uses these moments briefly and then sets them aside, because fully committing to a super-intelligent infant as a main character would create narrative problems the show is not equipped to solve. But the data points accumulate across the run, and the pattern they describe is consistent. Maggie's intelligence, however measured, is significantly above the norm for her age. Significantly above the norm for any age. Now consider the silence again. Maggie has been watching, from the beginning, how intelligence is treated in this family. Lisa Simpson is the most obviously intelligent member of the Simpson household. Lisa's IQ is high. The show has placed it variously between 156 and 167 depending on the episode. Lisa plays musical instruments, reads philosophy, engages with political and scientific ideas, and functions at an academic level that places her far outside the peer group she is forced to spend her days with. Lisa's intelligence is her defining characteristic, and the show has spent 36 seasons documenting what that characteristic does to a person in the specific environment of Springfield. It isolates her. It makes her lonely in ways that are sometimes played for comedy and sometimes allowed to be simply sad. It puts her in constant conflict with institutions that are not designed for minds like hers. It makes her relationships with her family difficult in a specific way she loves them, and she is consistently unable to reach them on the level where she most wants connection because the intellectual register she operates in is not one most of them can access. She is, in a small and private way, perpetually alone inside her own family. Lisa speaks. Lisa announces her intelligence. Lisa engages the world at the level her mind operates at, and the world responds by making her feel like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. Maggie has watched this. The theory that Maggie's silence is a choice rather than a limitation is supported by the specific nature of the moments when she does communicate. When Maggie has something to say, when she has a decision to make, or an action to take, or a position to express, she is not silent. She uses whatever means of communication are available to her: a gesture, an expression, a pointed stare that the recipient invariably understands. She is capable of making herself understood when she decides that being understood is worth the cost. The rest of the time she is silent, not because she has nothing to say, because she has looked at Lisa and understood that saying things costs more than not saying them in the specific economy of the Simpson household and the wider economy of Springfield. Silence in Springfield is the only posture that does not invite immediate appropriation or dismissal. Homer's voice is used against him constantly. He says things, and is immediately contradicted, ignored, or punished for them. Bart's voice is a weapon that turns back on him. Lisa's voice is a signal that marks her as different in ways that carry social cost. Marge's voice is consistently subordinated to the louder voices around her. Maggie sees this. Maggie has always seen this. And Maggie's response is to preserve her voice absolutely, to neither waste it on the daily friction of family life, nor permit it to be appropriated into someone else's story until she has something to do with it. That matters enough to warrant the expenditure. She has been saving her voice for 36 years. Whatever she is planning to say when she finally says it, it has had 36 years of thought behind it. Now, connect this to the mutation theory. If the radiation that flows from the plant produces different effects in different individuals, if the same environmental contamination that reduced Homer's intelligence to a clinical floor has been doing something different in his youngest daughter, then Maggie represents the other pole of the spectrum. Homer is what happens when radiation takes something away. Maggie is what happens when radiation amplifies something that was already there. A mind that was always going to be extraordinary in an environment that supercharges whatever biological capacity it encounters, producing in the smallest and youngest and most apparently helpless member of the family a cognitive capacity that none of the other residents of 742 Evergreen Terrace come close to matching. And she keeps it hidden, because the environment that created it is also the environment that would destroy it if she made it visible. The same Springfield that gave her this mind would spend it, instrumentalize it, flatten it into something useful to the people around her, rather than something she could develop on her own terms. So she sits on it. She watches, she waits. There is a moment in Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2, the resolution episode, where after the case has been closed and everyone has left the hospital room and the official version of events has been established, the camera finds Maggie alone. She looks around the room. She checks to make sure no one is watching. And then she performs a small motion with her pacifier that mimics the action of pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as a confession. Maggie did it. Maggie knows she did it. Maggie, in a moment of private acknowledgement, is confirming what the investigation established. But watch the sequence again. Watch the checking. She looks around the room with a deliberateness that goes well beyond the reflexive behavior of an infant. She is performing a security sweep. She is confirming that the room is empty before she does what she does next. That is not infant behavior. That is the behavior of someone who understands that certain actions have consequences if witnessed, and who has decided that the specific action they are about to take is one they will only perform in private. Whether she is confessing or she is remembering, whether the gesture means, "I did this," or "I watched this," is something the show has left beautifully, deliberately unresolved. Either way, what the moment proves is that Maggie understands more than anyone in Springfield suspects. She understands what happened. She understands that it was significant. She understands the importance of performing her knowledge only when she is certain no one can see her. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. And behind those enormous eyes, behind the pacifier she has been sucking for longer than most governments have lasted, something extraordinary is thinking, watching, filing things away with a precision that no one around her is equipped to appreciate. Maggie Simpson is the most dangerous person in Springfield. And she will remain the most dangerous person in Springfield for as long as she remains, in everyone else's estimation, just a baby. There is one more thing to add to this, and it requires connecting Maggie back to something we discussed in the section on mutations. If the Simpson children were born in Springfield, to parents who had already been exposed to the plant's contamination for years, then all three of them are products of that exposure in their biology before they were born. Bart shows it in his aggression and his specific kind of creative intelligence, the lateral, destabilizing mind that goes sideways where most people go forward, which might be the contamination's specific expression in him. Lisa shows it in her hypersensitivity, her acute perceptual awareness, her inability to filter her emotional responses to the world in ways that other people seem to manage the contamination, amplifying whatever she perceives, making everything louder and more present than it should be. And Maggie shows it in whatever it is she has that we cannot measure, the intelligence that exceeds the instruments, the situational awareness that has no business existing in a 1-year-old body, the patience, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her, the patience to wait, to hold her position for 36 years, accumulating knowledge, watching her family and her town and her world, and not yet acting. Whatever the contamination gave Maggie, it gave her the long game. Whatever the contamination gave Maggie, it gave her the long game. And the long game has not yet concluded. One more thing about Maggie, and then we will move on. There is a flash-forward episode 1 of the show's several glimpses into possible futures that shows Maggie as a young adult. She is a performer, a musician. She is, in the future the show imagines for her, someone who has found a way to take the silence and turn it into sound. The pacifier is gone. The voice that has been accumulating for 36 years has finally found its outlet. The show cannot commit to this future, because committing to it would require the floating timeline to hold still long enough for Maggie to actually grow up. So the flash forward stays a flash forward, a glimpse through a closing window, and Maggie returns to being a baby with a pacifier. But the image persists, the idea of what Maggie's voice might sound like when it finally emerges. What she might do with 36 years of observation and accumulated intelligence and the specific clarity of a mind that has never been fooled into talking before. It had something worth saying. The show's writers, in imagining Maggie's future, chose music, not language, not argumentation or exposition, or the verbal combat that is the Simpson family's primary mode of interaction. Music, which is the thing that conveys meaning without requiring you to explain what you mean. The thing that can hold complexity without having to resolve it. The thing that reaches people in the part of them that is below language. Maggie's voice, when it comes, will not be words. It will be something older and more precise than words. It will be everything she has been waiting to say since she arrived in the world and realized that the world she had arrived in was not quite ready to hear it. Section 9. Mona Simpson and the Conspiracy That Built Homer. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the established fact. Abe Simpson told Homer she died when he was young. He showed him a grave. Homer mourned in the way that Homer mourns things loudly, briefly, with a directness that the show played for comedy, but that was also, genuinely, one of the consistent emotional wounds that shaped the Homer we knew. Homer did not have a mother. This was the backstory. And it explained things. It explained Homer's desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his willingness to absorb almost any amount of mistreatment from people he cared about rather than risk losing them, his clinginess toward Marge, his inability to push back against Burns in any sustained way, even as the show gave him increasingly clear evidence that pushing back would be justified. His tendency to find father figures in the men around him, Grandpa, who was himself emotionally remote, and Burns, who either did not know Homer's name or used its forgetting as a deliberate assertion of power. A boy who grew up without a mother grows up with a specific kind of wound. The shape of that wound is exactly the shape of Homer Simpson. In November of 1995, in the episode titled Mother Simpson, the show blew this backstory apart. Homer's mother was not dead. She had been alive his entire life. She had been living underground as a fugitive, unable to come home, unable to contact her son, unable to be present for the decades of his life that she had missed because the man Homer worked for had made her a fugitive. Burns. Let us trace this carefully, because the storyline is more constructed and more damning than it usually gets credit for. In 1969, Mona Simpson was an ordinary housewife living in Springfield with her husband Abe and her young son Homer. She was not a radical. She was not a troublemaker. She was a woman living a domestic life in a country that was, in that particular historical moment, in the middle of something: the civil rights movement, Vietnam, the counterculture. The protest movements of the late 1960s were not abstract political events. They were things that ordinary people in ordinary towns were navigating, choosing sides on, allowing to change them, or choosing to ignore. Mona did not ignore them. She was changed. She began associating with activists and found in that association a purpose she had not previously had access to. And the target her group chose to act against was not a symbolic or distant one. It was local. It was personal. It was a biological weapons laboratory in Springfield, owned and operated by Montgomery Burns. Let that settle. Burns did not just own the nuclear plant. He owned a facility for producing biological weapons in Springfield, in the same town where he had built his nuclear operation. In the community where Homer Simpson was growing up, where children went to school, where families went to the grocery store and the park and lived their lives without any idea that the richest man in their town was manufacturing weapons-grade pathogens in a laboratory they drove past every day. This is not played as a revelation that the show then investigates. It is treated as backstory, delivered in the episode's first act, and accepted by the audience as information without the full weight of its implications being made explicit. But those implications are considerable. Burns was not just negligent with the nuclear plant. He was actively building things designed to kill people in a residential community without the knowledge or consent of that community. Mona and her group broke into the lab. They detonated what the show calls an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological material inside. And during the escape, Mona stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. That person was Burns. She helped him. She showed him her face. And Burns, grateful or not, the show does not specify, reported her to the FBI. Mona Simpson became a fugitive that night. She could not return to her house. She could not call Abe. She could not hold her son. She kissed Homer goodbye while he was sleeping and disappeared. And Homer woke up to a mother-shaped absence that he would carry for the next 27 years. He carried it into every relationship. He carried it into his marriage and into his parenting and into his workplace. He carried it into his willingness to work for the man who had taken her away because he never connected the dots, never understood that the name on his paycheck was the name of the person responsible for the shape of the wound he had been living around since childhood. Homer worked for Burns his entire adult life. Burns destroyed his family. Homer never fully understood this. The show depicts his failure to connect these facts not as stupidity, not only as stupidity, but as something more structurally enforced. Homer's cognitive capacity, limited by the crayon and further eroded by decades of radiation exposure, cannot navigate abstract causal chains. He cannot trace the connection from Burns's action in 1969 to Mona's flight to his own motherless childhood, to his employment at the plant to the present. The chain is too long and the links are too indirect for the mind he has been left with. But someone constructed that chain deliberately. When Burns sees Mona through a cab window in the Season 7 episode, recognizes her after 27 years, immediately contacts the authorities. The show plays this as Burns being relentlessly vindictive. He holds a grudge. He sees an opportunity to finish what he started, and the FBI comes to the Simpson house, and Mona has to run again, and Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. This time he knows why she left. This time he knows who is responsible. And the show gives us a moment brief, quiet, without comedy where Homer understands the full architecture of his own deprivation. He sees the connection that his mind has been unable to make for his entire life. Burns took his mother. Burns took his childhood. Burns took the version of Homer who might have developed differently, might have had the emotional foundation to become something other than what he is. And then the episode ends, and the next episode begins, and Homer is back at the plant in Sector 7G, and Burns is in his office, and the moment of understanding dissolves back into the show's general fog. Because that is what Springfield does. Because Homer's mind cannot hold the connection without the fog reclaiming it. Because understanding the architecture of your own suffering, when you have been cognitively limited in the ways Homer has been, requires a sustained clarity that the environment conspires against. And then there is the deal, the Abe connection. The show reveals in a later season that Burns committed some unspecified crime, the nature of which the show has been deliberately vague about, and Grandpa Simpson discovered it. Abe and Burns struck an arrangement. Abe's silence in exchange for a guarantee. Homer would always have a job at the plant, no matter how many mistakes he made, no matter how many times he failed. Homer would be protected from termination in perpetuity. 742 documented errors. Never fired. Because his father made a deal with the enemy to protect a son who would never know the deal had been made. Grandpa, in this reading, is the most tragic figure in the Simpson family. He is a man who lost his wife to Burns's actions, who knew something terrible about Burns, who had the power to expose it and who instead chose a compromise. Who decided that protecting Homer's economic security was worth the price of silence? Who gave Burns the cover he needed and locked Homer into the plant for the rest of his working life, in exchange for a guarantee that the plant would keep his son employed? Abe protected Homer from poverty. He locked him in a cage to do it, and he never told Homer what the cage was or how it had been built. 3 generations of the Simpson family. All of them in some configuration of damage that traces back to one man's laboratory in 1969, one woman's decision to stop and help someone she should have run from, and one man's capacity for sustained vindictive institutional power. Burns ruined The Simpsons, not as a side effect of something else, not by accident. As the logical consequence of what he is and what he does, a man who uses his resources to protect his position, who pursues the people who threaten him, not because they hurt him, but because allowing them to go unpunished would signal a vulnerability he cannot afford to display. Mona fought Burns and lost everything. Abe made a deal with Burns and lost his integrity. Homer inherited the consequences of both and lost the capacity to understand them. And Burns won. Quietly, completely, across 3 generations, without ever once acknowledging the war. Because that is the other thing about the way powerful men like Burns operate. The war is never declared. There is never a confrontation, never an explicit accounting. There is only the slow institutional arrangement of circumstances so that the outcomes Burns wants become the outcomes that happen, and the people who might have prevented those outcomes find themselves, one way or another, unable to act. Mona is dead now. The show handled her death with unusual restraint and genuine feeling, a quiet scene, a hand being held, a man sitting beside a woman he barely knew and grieving 27 years that were taken rather than chosen. No comedy, no reset, just the weight of it. Homer sat with her and held her hand and lost her for the final time, and then went back to work. This is the ending of Mona's story in the show, and it is exactly the right ending because it is the most honest thing the show can say about Homer's situation. There is no catharsis that fully absorbs what happened. There is no confrontation with Burns that restores what was taken. There is no grand reckoning. There is just a man who found out too late the shape of the conspiracy that built him and who goes back to the plant on Monday because that is what you do when you are Homer Simpson in Springfield. But here is the thing I want you to carry from Mona's story into everything that follows. Mona Simpson was not a passive victim. She was an agent. She made choices, the choice to join the activists, the choice to target the lab, the choice, fatally, to stop and help the man she should have run from. These were choices made by someone who believed that doing the right thing, even at personal cost, was worth doing. She was wrong about the cost. She underestimated what Burns would do with the face he had seen. But she was not wrong about the lab, or the weapons, or the principle that led her there. She was a person who decided that knowing about something bad and doing nothing was not acceptable to her, and Springfield punished her for it for 27 years. Homer never got to know the version of his mother who made that choice. He got a ghost, a grave, a lie, and finally, at the end of her life, a few hours. Not enough time to understand who she was. Not enough time to understand that the qualities he had been told were weaknesses, his stubbornness, his occasional reckless loyalty. The moments when he acts on principle despite consequences might have come from someone worth knowing. Mona Simpson died, and her son went back to the plant, and the man who destroyed her family continued to live on his weekly treatments and his centuries of accumulated wealth, and nothing changed. Nothing ever changes in Springfield. That is the story. That has always been the story. But I want to say one more thing about Mona Simpson before we leave her behind, because her story is the one that most clearly shows the particular kind of damage Burns has done, not the contamination, not the cognitive suppression, but the interpersonal damage. The damage to the fabric of a family across generations. Homer grew up believing his mother chose not to be with him, that she died, which is a kind of not choosing, but the emotional residue is the same. A boy who understood himself as someone whose mother was not there. A boy who filled that absence with the particular compensatory behaviors that become, across time, the character traits we recognize as distinctly Homer, the neediness. The capacity for sudden, childlike joy when someone pays him positive attention. The terror of being alone. The way that any threat to his family, even a theoretical or distant threat, produces a reaction that is disproportionate to the situation, because the situation has never been just the situation. It has always also been that morning he woke up and she was gone. Abe Simpson made choices that compounded this. Abe, who knew the truth, who had the information that could have helped Homer understand his life differently, chose silence. He showed Homer a headstone. He built a story, and the story served Abe's purposes, protected him from having to explain his deal with Burns, protected him from having to acknowledge his own complicity in the arrangement that kept Homer at the plant. But it cost Homer 30 years of a foundational misunderstanding about himself. Because here is what the story cost Homer. It cost him the knowledge that his mother was someone who fought, who did something, who had political convictions and acted on them at personal cost and was still out there, somewhere, living with the consequences of having believed something enough to act on it. Knowing that would not have made Homer's childhood easier, but it might have given him a different relationship to his own capacity for belief, to his own capacity for resistance, to the thing inside him that occasionally, in the show's best moments, surfaces as genuine moral clarity, the Homer who knows when something is wrong, even if he cannot always articulate why. Homer's mother was someone who looked at the world and decided that accepting what was wrong was not an option. And Homer grew up not knowing that about her. Grew up thinking that whatever he is limited, impaired, fumbling, occasionally catastrophically wrong is simply what he was born as, rather than what the town made him. Knowing Mona would not have saved Homer, but it might have given him a slightly different story about himself. And a different story about yourself is not a small thing. It is, sometimes, the difference between accepting the fog and being angry enough about it to start asking what the fog is made of. Burns took that from him too. Section 10. The Town That Criminalized Truth. Season 9 of The Simpsons contains what is widely agreed to be the single most controversial episode in the show's history. Not controversial in the way that episodes about religion or politics are sometimes controversial not because it offended a constituency or pushed against a social boundary. Controversial because it did something to the show's internal consistency that many viewers experienced as a betrayal. An act of violence against the audience's relationship with a character they thought they knew. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper. It aired in September of 1997. And what it does is reveal that Principal Seymour Skinner, the buttoned-down, Vietnam veteran, mother-dominated, perpetually ineffective authority figure who had been a fixture of Springfield Elementary for the entire run of the show, is not who he says he is. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. The actual Seymour Skinner, the real one, the man whose name and identity and military record Armin has been living inside for 20 years, was a Vietnam War veteran who was believed killed in action and turns out to have survived. He comes to Springfield to reclaim his life, and Springfield holds a vote. The vote is about whether to acknowledge the truth, and Springfield votes no. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree. Armin Tamzarian is Seymour Skinner. The real Seymour Skinner is expelled from the town, loaded onto a train and physically removed. And in what the show presents as a throwaway punchline, but which is, on reflection, one of the most chilling moments in the entire series, Judge Snyder makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention the Tamzarian name again, under penalty of torture. Fans hated this episode. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner and has done so for the show's entire run, has publicly expressed his displeasure with it. Critics cited it as the moment the show definitively stopped caring about its own continuity. The episode consistently ranks at the bottom of fan quality polls. It is the shorthand, for many viewers, for everything the later seasons got wrong. I want to make the opposite argument. I want to make the case that The Principal and the Pauper is the most honest episode the show ever produced. Not the best, not the most enjoyable, the most honest. Because what it does, what it actually depicts, stripped of the comedy and the cartoon framing, is show you the machinery of Springfield's reality. Not imply it, not embed it in subtext. Show it to you, on screen, in explicit and legal terms. Here is a truth. Here is the evidence. Here is the actual person whose identity was stolen, standing in front of you, asking for the acknowledgement that truth demands. And here is the vote. The vote is the key thing. Because Springfield does not simply ignore the truth, the way it ignores the three-eyed fish, or the billionaire who glows in the dark, or the nuclear plant with 342 safety violations. Those things are ignored through inertia, through the accumulated weight of normalization, through the way that any condition, however alarming, becomes invisible when it is the consistent background of daily life. But the Tamzarian truth is not inert. It arrives in motion. It has a face. It has a voice. The real Seymour Skinner is standing in the room, making a claim, offering evidence. The community cannot pretend not to notice. They are forced, in this episode, to make an active choice. And they choose the lie. They choose the comfortable fiction over the inconvenient reality. Not because they are evil, not because they are particularly stupid, because the truth, the real Seymour Skinner, with his authentic life and his legitimate claims, disrupts the social structure they have built around the fake one. They know Armin as Skinner. They have relationships with Armin as Skinner. The routines of their daily life, particularly the routines of Springfield Elementary, are organized around Armin as Skinner. Accepting the truth would require reorganizing all of that. It would require acknowledging that everything they thought was the case for 20 years was constructed on a lie. And that acknowledgement would ripple outward in ways that are genuinely disruptive. So they vote to maintain the fiction. And they make maintaining the fiction legal. And they make challenging the fiction illegal. This is not, as the show's critics argued, a betrayal of Springfield's character. This is Springfield's character, rendered explicit for the first and only time in the show's run. Think about how many times Springfield has faced information that should permanently alter its reality and chosen, instead, to reset. The town has been sealed under an EPA dome. It has been destroyed and rebuilt. It has survived a musical about its own civic dysfunction. It has watched Burns block out the sun. It has seen its nuclear plant inspected and found massively wanting and seen nothing change. It has watched episode after episode as problems arrive, consume an episode's plot, and then vanish without a trace by the following week. Fans call this the episodic reset. Critics call it lazy writing. The Tamzarian episode calls it what it actually is: a collective choice. An active, ongoing decision by the community to maintain a version of reality that is livable over a version that is true. Springfield does not forget. Springfield votes to forget. And it votes every week, in the unspoken referendum of daily life, to maintain the agreed-upon version of events. The town is not cognitively impaired well. It may be cognitively impaired by radiation, but that is not the only reason it resets. The reset is also a deliberate communal act, a social technology, a mechanism for preserving functional stability in the face of an accumulated reality that would, if fully acknowledged, be genuinely unbearable. If Springfield fully acknowledged what the plant has done to it, the acknowledgement would require confronting Burns. Confronting Burns would require confronting the economy. Confronting the economy would require acknowledging that the entire material foundation of the town's existence is built on its own contamination, that Springfield's prosperity and Springfield's poisoning are the same thing viewed from different angles. That is not a thing communities can usually face. So, they don't. They vote to maintain the fiction. They make it illegal to speak the Tamzarian name. They load the truth onto a train and send it somewhere else. The real Seymour Skinner is, in this reading, a metaphor for every uncomfortable fact Springfield has ever expelled. He is the three-eyed fish that was caught and dismissed. He is the honest safety inspection that never resulted in remediation. He is every moment where someone in Springfield almost asked the question, why are we all like this? Why does nothing here ever change and was talked out of it, or socially pressured away from it, or simply found that the infrastructure of daily life made it easier not to ask? The last honest man in Springfield, loaded onto a train and sent away forever. Now consider what the Tamzarian episode means under the coma theory. If Homer is dreaming, if everything since April 1993 is the product of his unconscious mind, then this is Homer's dreaming brain, producing a story about the value of maintained fictions. Homer's coma dream is itself a maintained fiction. It is the comfortable version of his life, held in place by his unconscious mind against the inconvenient reality of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, slowly losing brain function. Homer's dream needs to believe that comfortable fictions can be legally maintained, that if the community votes hard enough for the lie becomes the truth, and the truth becomes something that can be expelled and forgotten. Because Homer's coma is a comfortable fiction, and if comfortable fictions can be expelled by reality, if the real Seymour Skinner always comes back eventually, then Homer's dream is always at risk. So Homer's dreaming mind invents a Springfield that has solved this problem, that has found the mechanism by which the comfortable fiction can be permanently insulated from the truth that would destroy it. The decree is the mechanism, the vote is the ritual, and Armin Tamzarian is Principal Skinner, forever, by legal authority, in a town that has decided to make the law serve the fiction rather than the truth. That is Springfield. That has always been Springfield. The principal and the pauper just showed you the vote. Consider as a final note on this episode what it means for the show's self-image. The writers of The Simpsons, in making this episode, were not attempting to damage the show they had built. They were not being nihilistic about their own creation. They were doing what the show had always done in its best moments, following a satirical observation to its logical conclusion, regardless of how uncomfortable that conclusion was. The observation was, communities choose comfortable fictions over uncomfortable realities. The show had been making this observation implicitly for 8 seasons. In The Principal and the Pauper, it made it explicitly. It dramatized the mechanism. It showed you the vote, the decree, the exile, and the audience punished the show for it, which is, when you think about it, exactly what the episode predicted would happen. The audience, presented with the truth about how Springfield maintains its fictions, responded by demanding that the truth be retracted, by calling the episode the worst in the show's history, by insisting that the comfortable fiction Skinner is Skinner, we know him, we are comfortable with him be restored. Springfield voted to maintain the lie, and then the audience voted to maintain the lie about Springfield. The episode is the show watching itself be proved right in real time and being punished for it. The Principal and the Pauper is the most honest thing The Simpsons ever did. We just voted against it. But there is a coda to the Tamzarian story that the show itself has never quite articulated, and which I think is worth sitting with before we move on. Armin Tamzarian, in the episode's framing, is a fraud. A man who stole an identity, who built 20 years of a life inside someone else's name. And the show asks you to feel sympathy for him to understand why he took the identity, to recognize that the Skinner he became was, in many respects, a better Skinner than the fraud deserved to be. He grew into the name. He served the school. He maintained the relationships such as they were. He was, in the performance of Seymour Skinner, genuinely present in ways the real Skinner might not have been if his life had gone differently. But here is the thing. Armin Tamzarian did not just take a name. He took a relationship. He took Agnes Skinner's relationship with her son. He allowed a mother to believe her child had come home when he had not. He received the love that the real Skinner had earned by existing and never getting the chance to receive. Every meal Agnes cooked for Armin as Skinner, every argument, every moment of maternal manipulation disguised as concern, all of that belonged to a different person who was alive somewhere and getting none of it. And when the real Skinner arrived, Springfield could not make room for him. because making room for him would require acknowledging that all of those meals and arguments and moments had been given to the wrong person. And no community, no institution, no family can absorb that acknowledgement without it costing more than they are willing to pay. So the real Skinner is put on a train, and Agnes continues to cook for Armin. And the relationship continues, contaminated now by the truth that everyone in it knows and none of them will say. There is something here about what Springfield does with all of its contamination. Not just the nuclear kind, all of it. Every false story, every maintained fiction, every instance of love given to the wrong recipient or trust placed in someone who had no right to it, all of this continues. In Springfield, because the cost of acknowledging the contamination is always calculated as higher than the cost of living with it. Agnes and Armin in that house on the hill, Homer and Burns in that plant by the river. Every relationship in Springfield, carrying inside it something that is not quite what it appears to be, not quite what was agreed to, not quite what the people in it would choose if they could choose clearly. The town is not just contaminated physically, it is contaminated relationally. The lies and the fictions and the maintained silences are in the water the same way the radiation is. And they have been there long enough that nobody remembers a time before them. Springfield before Burns. Springfield before the plant. Springfield before the vote to forget. What would it have looked like? What would the people have looked like? With 5 fingers and natural skin color and no crayon in Homer's skull and no decades of radiation in the water? The show has never gone there. The show cannot go there because the show is Springfield, and Springfield has made it illegal to remember. Section 11. The predictions. Every few months, something happens in the real world, and someone opens a browser tab, finds a Simpsons clip from 1993 or 1998 or 2002 and posts it with the caption, "They predicted it again." Smartwatches, the Disney-Fox merger, Donald Trump's presidency, the Higgs boson particle, a pandemic spreading from Asia. Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra, video calling, autocorrect. The particular choreography of a specific celebrity descending a specific escalator. The list is long and the internet has curated it carefully. The Simpsons predicted the future. This is the claim. And the claim has attached itself to the show's cultural reputation in ways that are now inseparable from how most people who have not watched the show in 20 years think about it. I want to do something with this that most takes on the topic do not do. I want to take the prediction phenomenon seriously enough to look at it from both directions to understand why the debunking is correct, and also to understand why the debunking does not fully account for what is actually interesting about this. Let us start with the debunking, because it is genuine and it matters. Al Jean, the executive producer who has overseen more of The Simpsons run than anyone else, has addressed the predictions directly. His answer is the correct one, stated with appropriate bluntness. If you throw enough darts, you will hit some bullseyes. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of individual jokes, observations, predictions, and satirical extrapolations. The total volume of specific claims the show has made about the future of American culture, technology, and politics is enormous in the thousands, at minimum. When you generate thousands of specific predictions over decades and then filter the results through the most powerful confirmation bias engine in human history, which is social media, where sharing a successful prediction costs nothing, and sharing a failed one actively harms the narrative you are trying to tell you, will produce a highlight reel that looks like prophecy. The misses are invisible. The hits are viral. The psychological effect on the audience is the perception of uncanny accuracy, even when the underlying batting average is ordinary. Producer Bill Oakley has put it plainly. Most of the supposed predictions are coincidences, because the episodes are so old that history has simply had time to catch up with enough of them. And the mechanism is even more mundane than pure chance. The Simpsons writers, in the show's peak years, were one of the most educated writing rooms in television history. Multiple Harvard graduates, people with backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, physics, political theory. These were not people pulling random ideas from thin air. They were careful, well-read observers of American culture who understood trends and extrapolated them to their logical conclusions. The Trump prediction, which is the headline example, the one everyone cites, was not prophecy. Trump had been discussing a presidential run since at least the late 1980s. By 2000, when the episode aired, the joke about Trump becoming president was not a random guess. It was a satirical observation about where celebrity politics was heading, made by people who had been watching American politics carefully. The surprise is not that they made the joke. The surprise is that it took 16 more years for the punchline to arrive. The Disney-Fox merger was not prophecy either. Media consolidation was an accelerating and visible trend. The joke about a mega-corporation swallowing its competitors was not a prediction of a specific event, it was an observation about a tendency, and the tendency eventually produced the specific event. The smartwatch was not a prediction. The miniaturization of computing was already happening. Anyone paying attention in the mid-1990s could see where that trend was going. The writers saw it and drew a picture of it on a character's wrist. This is the debunking, and it is correct. The prediction phenomenon is real as a cultural effect and mostly illusory as evidence of anything uncanny. But here is what the debunking does not fully account for. The Simpsons has been running for 36 years. It has been running for 36 years, during which it has been one of the most widely watched, most quoted, most culturally embedded pieces of American media in existence. Its jokes have entered the language. Its observations have become reference points. Its visual vocabulary has become part of the way Americans process and organize their understanding of their own culture. When The Simpsons made a joke about Trump becoming president in 2000, that joke entered the cultural bloodstream. Millions of people saw it. It became something people said at parties, shared as early internet content, referenced when Trump appeared on the news. The joke did not predict the future. The joke made the future feel familiar. It primed the cultural imagination. It made the idea of a Trump presidency feel less like an impossible shock and more like an inevitable punchline that had been set up 16 years earlier. And when the punchline arrived, the cultural response was not purely shock. There was, alongside the shock, a strange recognition, a sense that this had been anticipated. Not because The Simpsons saw the future, but because The Simpsons had spent 16 years making this future feel like something that had already been written. The show does not predict America. The show shapes America's sense of what is possible and inevitable, because it has been the cultural wallpaper for long enough that its observations have become the frame through which Americans process new information. Springfield isn't a mirror, or rather, it started as a mirror and became something else over 3 decades. It became the thing people looked at when they wanted to know what something meant. It became the interpretive frame. And when reality catches up to something the frame already contains, it produces the uncanny feeling of prophecy. But what actually happened is that the frame was built first, and reality walked into it. The show made media consolidation feel inevitable. When Disney bought Fox, people reached for The Simpsons episode because The Simpsons had already told them that this was how things go. The Simpsons had given them the story that made the news event legible. The event did not confirm the prediction. The prediction had already made the event familiar. This is a more interesting phenomenon than either the prophecy believers or the debunkers are fully accounting for. It is the story of what happens when a piece of popular culture runs long enough and penetrates deeply enough into the cultural substrate that it begins to function as infrastructure. As the cognitive scaffolding inside which people interpret new information, Springfield isn't a crystal ball. Springfield is a lens. And we have been looking through it for so long that we have forgotten we are looking through something. And now, one more thing about the predictions that neither side discusses much. The show has also made predictions that failed. Spectacular, confident, elaborate predictions that simply did not come true. Jetpacks, moon colonies, specific technologies that were clearly visible on the horizon in 1993 and simply never materialized. Political outcomes that went the other way. Social trends that reversed. Cultural shifts that the show anticipated with confidence and that reality declined to produce. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody shares the failed predictions. The confirmation bias is not a passive phenomenon. It is actively maintained by the choices people make about what to share, what to preserve, what to include in the highlight reel. The Simpsons prediction record is curated, in real time, by an audience that has a stake in the prophecy narrative being true. Because a show that predicted the future is more interesting and more meaningful than a show that simply ran for a very long time and occasionally aligned with the direction events happened to take. We want The Simpsons to be prophetic. We want it to mean more than it does. And so we build the case for its prophecy from the evidence that supports it and quietly set aside the evidence that doesn't, which is, in its way, exactly what Springfield does. Let me give you one more angle on this, because I think it is the most interesting and least discussed dimension of the prediction phenomenon. The Simpsons did not just make cultural predictions. It made predictions about its own medium, about television, about the way American culture would consume stories and characters and franchises in the decades to come. And in this specific category, its accuracy is harder to attribute to volume and confirmation bias alone. In a Season 4 episode and early one, from the show's golden years, there is a sustained satirical treatment of the American television industry that depicts network executives as people entirely disconnected from creative values, making decisions about programming based on focus groups and market research, and the desire to reproduce previously successful formats rather than generate new ones. The satire is sharp. The writers clearly knew something firsthand about how television decisions were actually made. But here is the prediction embedded in the satire. The world, the episode describes a television landscape governed entirely by commercial calculation, where the audience is treated as a variable to be optimized rather than a community to be served, is the world that streaming and algorithm-driven content delivery eventually produced and entrenched. The episode was describing where the television industry was heading with enough precision that, 30 years later, it reads not as an exaggerated caricature of 1993's network culture, but as a fairly accurate description of 2025's content production ecosystem. The Simpsons did not predict streaming, but it predicted the logic that streaming would institutionalize. It predicted that the commercial pressures that were already visible in the early 1990s, applied with more data and more computational power over 3 more decades, would produce an entertainment environment that optimized for engagement over everything else. That rewarded the familiar over the new. That turned audiences into metrics and stories into intellectual property portfolios. And what is The Simpsons itself, in 2025, if not a case study in exactly that outcome? A show that has been running long enough that it has become intellectual property in the fullest corporate sense, owned, maintained, produced, distributed, and merchandised as an asset rather than created as an expression of something someone wanted to say. A show that exists, at this point, primarily because it would cost more to end it than to continue it, and because the corporate structures that own it have made ending it essentially impossible from a legal and financial standpoint. The Simpsons predicted the conditions that would make The Simpsons irreplaceable, not through prophecy, through the same sharp observation of institutional logic that made its early satire so accurate. The writers of the early seasons understood how television worked well enough to understand where it was going. And where it was going was toward a world where a show like The Simpsons, once it reached a certain scale, could never be allowed to stop. The show's most accurate prediction about itself is that it would still be here. Section 12. Ned Flanders, Hans Moleman, and the Floating Timeline. Let us end with the 3 things that tie everything together. The man next door, the man who keeps dying, and time. Ned Flanders has lived next door to The Simpsons for 36 years. He has been, in that time, a recurring comedy target, a foil for Homer's resentment, a representation of a kind of earnest Christian decency that the show has alternately satirized and, in its more honest moments, taken seriously as a genuine mode of being in the world. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer is not. He is physically fit. He is financially responsible. He is devoutly religious and remarkably consistent about living according to the values that religion espouses. He is patient with his children, generous with his neighbors, and disciplined in the ways that Homer is most spectacularly undisciplined. By every objective measurement of the kind of outcomes that are supposed to follow from doing the right things, Ned Flanders should have the better life. He does not. His wife Maude was killed at the Springfield Speedway when Homer, dodging incoming t-shirts from a promotional cannon, allowed them to hit her instead. Homer's selfishness, in that moment, cost Maude her life. She was knocked from the bleachers. She did not survive the fall. And Ned, because Ned is Ned, forgave Homer. Not eventually, not reluctantly, not with visible struggle, with the practiced speed of a man whose entire personality has been organized around the suppression of any response that is not gracious acceptance. The show later revealed why. In an episode in which Ned has a psychological breakdown triggered by the collapse of a badly built house, the community constructed for him after a hurricane, he is committed to a mental health facility where his psychiatrist uncovers the origin of his relentless positivity. Ned was, as a child, feral, uncontrollable. His parents, who were beatniks who did not believe in traditional discipline, had no tools for managing him. They brought him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him using methods that, in retrospect, amount to behavioral reprogramming. The rage was systematically removed. The violence was systematically removed. The capacity for self-assertion was systematically removed. What remained was Ned. Everything that reads as saintly about Ned Flanders is, in this light, not a choice. It is a program running. The patience is not patience, it is the absence of the alternative that was conditioned away before he was old enough to consent to having it removed. The forgiveness is not grace, it is the only response a nervous system that cannot access anger is capable of producing. The faith is not conviction, it is the framework a man needs to explain why he keeps suffering without being permitted to be angry about it. Ned is not good. Ned is trapped in a performance of goodness that he cannot exit because the exit was sealed before he understood there was one. And the show knows this. It has shown you the man underneath the performance, in the breakdown episode and in smaller moments throughout the run. It has shown you the darkness behind the okely-dokely, the grief that is always present but never directly expressed, the accumulating weight of a life that has been managed rather than lived. And what has being good in Springfield gotten Ned? His wife is dead. His house was destroyed. His neighbor has never genuinely appreciated him. And God, in the show's own internal continuity, where God is a character who has spoken directly to Homer on multiple canonical occasions, has never once spoken to Ned. The drunk who falls asleep in church gets divine conversation. The man who has organized his entire existence around his faith gets silence. This is not a coincidence within the show's logic. This is the show making a specific and uncomfortable observation about the relationship between virtue and reward. Not in a nihilistic way, not as a statement that goodness is worthless, but as an honest acknowledgement that the universe, as The Simpsons depicts it, does not reliably reward virtue. The systems that are supposed to reward virtue, social systems, economic systems, divine systems, are as susceptible to capture and distortion as every other system in Springfield. They reward the compliant and the lucky and the powerful, in the same rough proportion that they do in the actual world. Ned is the most compliant man in Springfield. He was programmed to be compliant before he understood what compliance was, and his reward is the life we have watched him live for 36 years. A life of accumulated loss, managed through a faith that has never been answered, expressed through a positivity that is the scar tissue of an older wound. He is, in the end, the saddest character in the show. Not because the show is cruel to him, but because it is honest about what his situation actually is. Homer is too cognitively impaired to fully comprehend his own suffering. Burns is too powerful to face consequences. Bart is too young to have given up. Lisa still believes, despite everything, that improvement is possible, but Ned knows. At some level he has no access to in his conscious life, but that surfaces in the breakdown, in the late-night moments where the performance slips. Ned knows that he has been cheated. Not by a person, by the premise, by the implicit contract that said if you do the things you are supposed to do, the things you are supposed to get will follow. He did the things. They did not follow. He forgave Homer for his wife's death. He rebuilt. He kept going. He kept smiling and helping and being a good neighbor to the worst neighbor in Springfield. And the world continued to offer him nothing that the world should not have offered him anyway. Now, Hans Moleman. Hans Moleman is a background character, tiny, elderly, apparently nearly blind, permanently wearing an oversized coat and thick-lensed glasses that make his eyes look enormous. He exists, in his primary function within the show, to suffer. He is hit by cars. He is crushed. He is buried. He is burned. He is electrocuted. He is subjected to a catalog of cartoon violence that, across the show's run, has made him the most frequently killed character in the history of American animated television. He dies and comes back, over and over. The deaths happen in regular canonical episodes, not in dream sequences or special Halloween episodes. Molleman dies on a Tuesday, and the following week he is standing at the bus stop, apparently none the worse for it, ready to be killed again. The show treats this as a running gag. Molleman dies, the audience laughs, next episode he is fine. Do not think about it. But if you think about it, under the radiation theory, Molleman represents the extreme end of a spectrum. If the nuclear plant's contamination produces mutations that vary by individual, if it diminished Homer's intelligence while amplifying Maggie's, if it altered the biology of every long-term Springfield resident in ways specific to their individual biology, then perhaps what the contamination did to Hans Molleman is alter the fundamental process of cellular death and regeneration. Perhaps Molleman's biology, saturated by decades of exposure, has become unable to sustain permanent death. His cells reconstitute, his body rebuilds. Not because he is resilient in the way Homer is resilient, Homer endures damage, but because Molleman actually dies and comes back, which is a different and considerably stranger process. The show also establishes, in a throwaway canonical moment, that Hans Molleman is 31 years old. He appears to be in his 80s. If he is telling the truth and the show gives us no reason to doubt this, then something has aged Molleman catastrophically. Something has taken a man who should be in the early middle of his life and turned him into what we see. Something in Springfield's environment has run time forward inside his body at a rate that bears no relationship to the time passing outside it, and then made him indestructible. These two effects, premature aging and immunity to death, are not contradictory under the radiation theory. They are the same process viewed from different angles. The contamination has altered his relationship to time, both the biological time that should have moved more slowly through his body and the terminal time that should have concluded it. It has made him old before his time and immune to the aging process's conclusion. Molleman is what Springfield's contamination looks like when it encounters a certain kind of body. He is the town's most extreme case. The thing that happens when the environmental exposure that yellows skin and reduces finger counts and suppresses intelligence encounters a biology that responds with something different, something stranger, something that makes death a revolving door instead of an ending. Nobody in Springfield has ever investigated Molleman's repeated deaths. Nobody has ever asked how he keeps coming back. This is consistent with how Springfield handles all of its anomalies, with the collective decision not to notice, not to document, not to create a paper trail that might lead someone to ask questions about the town's environment. Molleman dies and returns and dies and returns, and Springfield agrees not to find this interesting, and so it is not interesting, and the system continues. And then there is time. We have been moving toward this from the beginning, and it is where every theory we have discussed tonight ultimately arrives. The floating timeline. The permanent present. The fact that Bart Simpson was 10 years old in 1989 and is 10 years old now and will, by every indication the show has given us, be 10 years old for as long as the show continues to run. Nobody ages. Nobody moves. The children do not grow up. The parents do not grow old. The town does not progress. The years pass outside Springfield, but inside Springfield, time is not passing, it is accumulating, piling up, pressing against the walls of the show's world without being allowed inside. And every theory we have discussed offers a different account of why. The radiation theory says the contamination has altered the biology of Springfield's residents at the cellular level, producing a kind of biological stasis that prevents the normal processes of aging from proceeding. The same nuclear exposure that mutated the fish and yellowed the skin has, at some deeper level, disrupted the cellular mechanics of time. The coma theory says nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who last saw them in 1993. Homer's dreaming brain cannot imagine his children growing up because he was not there to watch it happen. His unconscious mind has preserved his family at the ages they were when he lost consciousness, because that is the only version of them his memory contains. The collective denial theory says the floating timeline is Springfield's social contract applied to time itself. The town has voted, in its ongoing unspoken referendum, not to acknowledge the passage of years, because acknowledging them would require acknowledging everything that the years have contained: the contamination, the cover-ups, the dealt deaths and broken promises and accumulated costs of living in the shadow of that plant. And the Burns immortality theory says that if one person in Springfield has found a way to arrest the biological progression that should eventually kill him, then the concept of aging is already negotiable in this universe. If Burns can hold time at bay for himself through money and technology, then perhaps the entire town exists in a temporal field that his influence has distorted. All four are saying the same thing. Time has stopped in Springfield because something in Springfield's specific combination of contamination and denial and unconscious longing and engineered power has broken time's normal operation. The show has imagined what it would look like if time were allowed to pass. There are flash-forward episodes, glimpses of possible futures where Bart and Lisa are adults, where Maggie has grown, where Homer and Marge are old. These futures are specific and emotionally rich. The show is capable of imagining them. It has imagined them in enough detail that the futures feel genuinely earned, feel like they follow naturally from who the characters actually are. And then the episode ends and the timeline resets and the characters are their canonical ages again and the future is sealed behind a door that will not open for more than a single episode's duration. The show can imagine growth. It refuses to allow it. And the reason it refuses is not purely narrative convenience. The reason, if we are willing to sit with it honestly, is that we have built the refusal into the show by watching it. We are the mechanism. We are the ones who return to it every week and demand that it remain what it was. We are the ones who would feel, and have historically felt, a sense of loss when the show changes too much from its foundational premise. We are the ones who celebrate the golden age and mourn the departure from it, and create the cultural pressure that makes returning to the static premise the safest thing the show can do. The floating timeline is sustained by our attention. Our continued watching is the vote that maintains it. Every time we press play, we are participating in the same referendum that Springfield holds every week. The decision to preserve the comfortable fiction over the inconvenient reality that time passes and things change, and the family that we love will eventually be something different from what it was. We trapped them. In 1989, we sat down and watched a yellow family argue on a couch and we fell in love with them. And over the following 36 years, we watched with enough consistency and with enough emotional investment that the show could not let the family change, because changing the family might cost it our love. And so the children stayed young, and the parents stayed middle-aged, and Springfield stayed exactly the town it was when we first arrived. We pressed pause. We have been pressing pause for 36 years, because letting them age would mean admitting that we are older, that the world they were made to represent, the anxious, optimistic, chaotic, genuinely loving, middle-class American family of the late 1980s, is a historical artifact now. That the couch we sat on watching them, the specific domestic life those first seasons captured, has been replaced by something different and is never coming back. As long as The Simpsons runs, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Maggie is reaching for things she cannot quite grasp, we do not have to admit that. We can go home to Evergreen Terrace every Sunday night, or whenever the algorithm serves it to us, and the family will be there. The house will be the same. Homer will come through the door. Marge will be at the stove. Bart will be watching television. Lisa will be playing her saxophone in her bedroom, alone, working through something she has not yet found the words for. And Maggie will be in her high chair, watching everything with those enormous eyes, keeping her own counsel about what she sees and what she plans to do about it. The loop is ours. We made it and we maintain it. And every night we watch, we tighten it a little more. Consider what it means that we have been watching The Simpsons for so long that the show has become a generational handoff. There are people in their 30s and 40s right now who watched The Simpsons as children, who remember specific episodes with the clarity that people usually reserve for their own memories. And those people are now watching the same show with their children. The couch has changed, the television has changed, the streaming service has replaced the broadcast schedule, but the family on screen is exactly the same. Bart is 10, Homer is in his 30s. The house on Evergreen Terrace is unchanged. The children of people who grew up with The Simpsons are meeting a family that has not aged since before their parents were born. They are being handed something that already carries decades of someone else's emotional history. They receive it fresh, without that accumulated weight, and they see a cartoon family that is funny and chaotic and warm. They do not yet feel the gap between Springfield's stillness and their own passage of time, because they have not yet accumulated enough time to feel it. They will. One day they will go back to an episode they watched with a parent, and the parent will be older in a way that the people on screen are not, and they will feel, for the first time, the specific quality of the relationship between this family and the passage of time. And they will understand, in that moment, what the show has really been about all along. Not Springfield, not Burns, or the plant, or the shooting, or the coma. The show has been about the way we love things that do not change when we do. The way we need something to hold still while we move. The way a family, even a fictional one, even a yellow cartoon family with 4 fingers and impossible hair, can become the place we go when the real world is moving too fast to catch. That is the secret the floating timeline has been keeping. It was never about The Simpsons. It was always about us. But I want to stay with Ned for a moment longer before we leave section 12, because there is something about his situation that the show has depicted across 36 years without quite articulating, and I think it is one of the most important things the show has ever done. Ned Flanders has lost more than anyone else in Springfield. More than Homer, who has lost his mother and his cognitive potential and his dignity on a weekly basis, but who has been, by the grace of his own limitations, largely protected from fully understanding the scale of those losses. More than Lisa, who has lost the community she deserved but who still has time, still has possibility, still has the future that her age makes available to her. More than even Burns, who has never had anything warm enough to lose, what Ned has lost is faith in the system. Not religious faith, his Christianity is, if anything, more tenacious than ever, though the show has given it plenty of reasons to buckle. The system he has lost faith in is the moral system, the arrangement that says, if you do the right things, the right outcomes follow. If you treat people with kindness, they will treat you with kindness. If you forgive, you will receive something worth receiving in return. If you maintain your integrity in a world that does not reward integrity, the integrity itself is worth maintaining. Ned has done all of these things for 36 years, with consistency that no other character in Springfield comes close to matching. And the world has given him a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor who exploits him, and a God who converses with Homer Simpson. The show has never resolved this. It has never offered Ned a genuine payoff, a moment of recognition that compensates for what his goodness has cost him. And this is not an oversight. The show does not offer Ned a payoff because the show is honest enough to know that the moral system Ned has been operating inside does not reliably produce payoffs. It produces Ned Flanders, a good man who keeps being good because the alternative has been conditioned out of him in a town that cannot afford to acknowledge what his goodness costs him, because acknowledging it would require examining what Springfield costs everyone who tries to be something in it. Next door, Homer Simpson falls asleep on the couch and knocks a lamp over and wakes up the next morning and goes to work. He has not tried to be good. He has not maintained any standard of behavior that the word integrity would apply to. He forgets things and breaks things and occasionally causes genuine harm to the people around him through pure inattention. And he has Marge, and he has his children, and he has the house, and he has the job. He has, by the measures that matter most to the people in it, a full life. The gap between Ned's moral output and Homer's moral output, measured against their respective life outcomes, is the show's most uncomfortable joke. Because it is not really a joke. It is an observation about luck and systems and the way that decency, in a world governed by the specific forces that govern Springfield, is not a competitive advantage. It is, if anything, a vulnerability. Now let us talk about what the floating timeline actually feels like to live inside if you are one of the characters trapped in it. The show has given us glimpses of what characters think about their own temporal stasis, and these glimpses are always slightly unsettling because the characters do not quite think about it at all. They do not experience themselves as frozen. They experience themselves as living in a continuous present, as people for whom the past is as hazy and inconsistent as dreams, and the future is simply not something they think about with the specificity that people living in linear time would require. Homer's backstory has changed. His high school years have been set in different decades. His courtship of Marge has been retold with different cultural reference points. His early career at the plant has been revised to accommodate the show's sliding timeline, and Homer does not remember any of this inconsistency because Homer does not have access to a consistent version of his own past. His memory, like everything else in Springfield, operates on the show's internal logic rather than the logic of linear time. From inside the loop is invisible. The characters of Springfield do not know they are living in a floating timeline any more than the residents of a real town know they are living in the specific moment of history that will later be defined by some event that has not happened yet. They have no vantage point from which to see the shape of the container they are in. They just live. They argue and eat and go to work and come home. The loop turns, the episode ends. The next one begins. And from inside that experience, if the characters could be said to have experiences, if the fictional people of Springfield can be said to feel anything, it would not feel like stasis, it would feel like life. It would feel like Tuesday, and then Wednesday, and then another week at the plant, and another Sunday with the family, and another crisis that resolves, and another morning that is more or less like the morning before. The horror of the floating timeline is only visible from outside it, only visible from the position of someone who watches the show across years and realizes that the years they have accumulated watching it are not years the characters have accumulated living through it. We have gotten older. They have not. And the asymmetry of that, the way we carry the weight of time while they carry nothing, is the relationship at the center of the whole enterprise. We age for them. We accumulate the years while they stay fixed. We bring the passage of time to them with every viewing, and they absorb none of it, and we keep coming back anyway, maybe because we need somewhere to put it. Somewhere time does not stick. Somewhere we can go and find the same family in the same house, making the same mistakes and surviving them the same way, and not have to think, for the duration of an episode, about how much everything else has changed. Springfield is not just where the Simpsons live. Springfield is where we go when we need a place that holds still. There is something worth naming here about what the floating timeline asks of us emotionally. It asks us to inhabit two temporal positions simultaneously. We are ourselves aging, accumulating, moving through a world that is genuinely moving, and we are also, for the duration of an episode, in a place that does not move. We hold both positions at once. We feel the relief of the stillness, and we feel, underneath it, the particular poignancy of something that can only be still because it is not alive in the way that we are alive. The Simpsons is not alive. It is a text. A very long, very complicated, richly inhabited text. But a text. It does not age. Because texts do not age. What changes, what accumulates, what carries the weight of time is us. We are the ones doing the aging. The family just holds the place while we do it, and every time we return to them and find them unchanged, we are reminded of the gap. The distance between what we carry and what they carry, which is nothing. The distance between our 36 years and their permanent April 1989, preserved in amber, immune to the passage of anything. We go there to rest from time. We come back carrying more of it than we had when we left. That is the transaction at the center of the longest-running show in American television history. We give our years to it. It gives us, briefly, the relief of a world where no years pass. Whether that is worth it is something each person who watches has to decide for themselves. I think, for most of the people who have been watching for a long time, the answer is yes. Not because the exchange is fair. It is not fair. We pay in years and receive only the illusion of a place that does not require them. But the illusion is very good, and the family is very real, in the way that fictional families become real after long enough. And sometimes what you need is not the truth about time. Sometimes what you need is a couch and a television and the sound of someone coming through the door. Homer coming through the door. Every time. Section 13. The characters nobody talks about and what they're hiding. There are characters at the margins of Springfield who have been present for 36 years and who the show has never fully examined. Figures who appear in the background of enough episodes, who carry enough internally consistent detail across decades of storytelling, that they stop being incidental and start being evidence. Evidence of things the show was working through without quite knowing it. Evidence of the larger system we have been tracing all night. Let us spend some time with them. Groundskeeper Willie. Willie is a Scottish immigrant. The show never specifies exactly when he arrived in Springfield, which is itself an interesting omission, who works as the groundskeeper at Springfield Elementary and lives, by every indication the show provides, in a shack on school property. He is physically enormous. He is temperamentally volcanic. He is, by the economic measures the show establishes, essentially destitute. His entire existence is his job, and his job is maintained in conditions that no employment law anywhere would sanction. And he loves his work. This is the thing about Willie that never quite adds up if you look at it squarely. He loves the school grounds with a passion that goes well beyond professional investment. He tends the grass with an intensity that the show plays as absurdity, but that, stripped of the comedy register, looks like the investment of a man who has found in those school grounds the thing that gives his life meaning. Willie does not have much. He has the grounds. And the grounds are, in whatever way is available to him, his. The show has used Willie as a recurring target across its run, someone who can be dropped into a storyline as a source of sudden explosive violence or operatic emotional outburst without affecting any of the main characters' arcs. But in the moments when the show has actually looked at Willie, really looked at him, with the care it sometimes brings to supporting characters, what it has found is a man in exile. A man who came to Springfield from somewhere else, for reasons the show has gestured at without committing to, and who stayed because staying was what his life became. Willie is a transplant who did not get out. He arrived before the exit became too expensive to take, or after it already had. And now he is of Springfield as yellow as anyone, as embedded in the town's specific dysfunction, as unlikely to leave as Homer himself. He is not a native, but he has become a local, and the difference between a native and a local, in a town like Springfield, is that the local chose to stay, or chose not to leave, which is a different thing and also the same thing. Then there is Principal Skinner. Not Armin Tamzarian, not the real Seymour Skinner who was expelled on a train the character as the show has used him across its run, the accumulated 36 years of a man defined by his relationship to two competing authorities, his mother, Agnes, and Bart Simpson. Agnes Skinner is one of the show's most consistent background presences, and she is terrible in ways the show has always played as comedy but which are, on examination, something more specific. Agnes is a woman who has used her son as her primary relationship for his entire adult life, who has organized her existence around his proximity, who has, the show makes this explicit in several episodes, actively sabotaged his attempts to develop relationships outside their household. She has undermined his romantic prospects. She has made herself the gravitational center of his daily life in ways that are played as domineering, but that function, in terms of the actual effect on Skinner's psychology, as something considerably darker. Skinner is trapped. He is a man in his 50s who lives with his mother, not because he is incapable of leaving, but because the specific psychological architecture of his childhood and adolescence has made him, as an adult, unable to fully commit to the act of leaving. He has the impulse. He has in various episodes come close. But Agnes always finds the thread that unravels the attempt. And Skinner, whatever he is, Armin or Seymour, the man or the fiction the man inhabits, returns to the house, returns to the school, returns to the loop. He is, in this reading, another version of Homer, not cognitively impaired in Homer's specific way, but constrained. Held in place by an authority he cannot fully resist, serving an institutional function that benefits the system more than it benefits him, returning to the same building every day to perform a role that was assigned to him before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. The difference is that Homer has Marge. Homer has the domestic warmth of the couch and the beer and the 3 children who are genuinely, imperfectly his. Skinner has Agnes. And the substitution of that dynamic for Homer's, the replacement of a loving, if chaotic family with a single domineering maternal presence, tells you something about what Springfield's contaminated environment produces when the specific alchemy of love and limitation goes slightly differently than it did in the Simpson household. Homer is broken but held. Skinner is intact but alone. The radiation or the coma or the collective denial or whatever the mechanism is has produced different variations on the same basic outcome. People who are not quite free, people who are in place, people who are, each in their own specific way, exactly where the system needs them to be. Now let us talk about Marge. We have discussed Homer at length and Maggie and Lisa. But Marge is the character the show has most consistently underused and most consistently relied on, in the specific combination that suggests the show has never quite known what to do with a character who is this central. Marge Bouvier married Homer Simpson when she was young and pregnant. In circumstances the show has returned to examine from several angles across its run. The choice she made is one the show treats as foundational as the bedrock decision from which everything else in the series follows. And the show has, in its better episodes, been honest about the complexity of that choice, honest about what Marge gave up, honest about the version of Marge that did not marry Homer, the artist, the person with ambitions and desires and a specific creative intelligence that the domestic life she chose has no real outlet for. There is an episode, a genuinely remarkable one, in which Marge discovers a talent for painting. She becomes, briefly, genuinely good at it. A local art dealer recognizes the talent and begins to promote her work. And then the plot mechanics intervene, as they always do in episodes about Marge's potential, and the talent is enclosed back into the life she already has, and the episode ends with the domestic status quo restored. This happens every time the show genuinely examines what Marge has given up for the family. The examination goes only so far. The potential is acknowledged and then recontained. The show cannot fully commit to the implications of what it finds when it looks at Marge carefully, because those implications would require a structural response, a genuine change in the family's dynamic, in Homer's responsibilities, in the weight distribution of the household that the show cannot make without destabilizing the premise. So Marge's potential is perpetually discovered and re-enclosed. Her talents appear and are redirected. Her frustrations surface and are absorbed. The patient, capable, slightly exhausted woman who holds this chaotic household together does so at a cost the show acknowledges in specific episodes and declines to fully reckon with in the aggregate. And here is the detail that connects Marge to the show's larger architecture of containment. Marge stays. Episode after episode, season after season, across 36 years, through Homer's endless failures and disasters and the specific gravitational pull of the Springfield environment, Marge stays. The show has tested this. There have been episodes in which she comes close to leaving, close to choosing a different life, a different man, a different version of herself. And she always comes back, always chooses the family, always chooses Homer, who is imperfect in ways that are sometimes funny and sometimes genuinely hard to watch. Why does she stay? The show has offered various answers across its run. Love, loyalty, the children, the specific, imperfect bond between two people who have been through enough together that the bond itself has become something neither of them could quite abandon. All of these are true in the moments the show presents them. But there is also this. Marge is in Springfield. She has been in Springfield her whole life. Her sisters are in Springfield. Her mother is in Springfield. Her history, her roots, her accumulated social network, all of it is in Springfield. And Springfield, as we have established, is a place that makes leaving extremely difficult. The economic dependency on the plant that holds Homer also holds Marge, because the household depends on that paycheck. The social density that makes Springfield feel like community also makes it feel like the only community available. The town wraps around the people in it in ways that are sometimes warm and sometimes like vines, and the two are not always distinguishable from each other. Marge is not just choosing Homer. She is choosing to stay in a place that has arranged its conditions to make staying the most coherent, available option. The choice is real. Her love is real. And the system that produces the conditions in which that choice becomes the easiest choice is also real. Springfield wins every time a Marge decides to stay. Not because staying is wrong, because the system that makes staying easy is the same system that makes everything else hard. And then there is the question that the show has never quite answered about Marge. What does she know? Marge is, by the evidence the show provides, considerably more perceptive than the world around her gives her credit for. She sees things. She notices the gaps in Homer's stories, the specific evasions, the moments where the surface of a situation does not match what she can sense underneath it. She has, in more than one episode, been shown to have understood something important before anyone else in the family to have had an accurate read on a situation while Homer was still in the phase of confident misdirection. What has Marge seen across 36 years of living in Springfield and paying attention? What has she noticed about the plant and its effects? About Burns and his age and his weekly treatments that produce a green glow? About her children's specific and unusual development? About the recurring environmental anomalies that the town consistently declines to investigate? The show does not answer this. Marge's perceptions are used in service of specific episode plots and then set aside, The accumulated picture of what Marge Bouvier Simpson, who is smart and attentive and has been watching Springfield from its domestic interior for 3.5 decades, actually understands about the town. That picture is never assembled. But it would be something. It would be, if you could access it, a considerably more complete account of what has been done to this family and this town than anything Homer could provide. Marge sees. Marge has always seen. The show just doesn't ask her what she's looking at. And this, in the end, is what it means to spend 36 years in the background of someone else's story. Willie tends his grass, Skinner manages his mother and his school, Molman absorbs his endless deaths without complaint, and Marge stands at the kitchen window, or at the stove, or at the kitchen table in the particular late-night posture of a woman who has been holding a household together for a very long time, and she sees what she sees, and she says what can be said given the audience for it, and she keeps going. Springfield is full of people like this. People who are present in every scene and centered in almost none. People who carry the weight of the town's daily functioning without being the ones the camera follows when something interesting happens. The show has always understood that these people exist. It has sometimes even paused to acknowledge them in the episode-long spotlights that the supporting cast occasionally receives. But the fundamental logic of the series keeps them where it needs them in the background, keeping the foreground possible. They are Springfield's infrastructure, the same way the plant is infrastructure, the same way the roads and the school and the modest civic institutions are infrastructure. Present, necessary, taken for granted, maintained at cost by people who mostly do not appear in the credits. The show has always been more honest about this than it gets credit for. It knows that the story it is telling, Homer's story, the family at the center, is supported by a vast network of peripheral lives that also matter and are also trapped and are also, in their own specific ways, being shaped by the same forces that shaped The Simpsons. Springfield is not just The Simpsons. Springfield is everyone in it. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every person who drinks the water and breathes the air and votes, every 4 years, for whoever burns is backing that cycle. We followed The Simpsons into Springfield, but Springfield was full before they arrived, and it will be full when they are gone, and it will be full when they are gone. If they are ever gone, which given 36 seasons and no end in sight, given the franchise economics and the cultural permanence, and the simple fact that the show has now outlasted every reasonable expectation anyone had for it in 1989, if they are ever gone, is a question that might not have an answer in our lifetimes. The Simpsons will be here when you wake up tomorrow. It will be here in 20 years. The family will be exactly where you left them, on the couch, at the plant, in the school, in the house on Evergreen Terrace, frozen, waiting, exactly as you remembered. Come back whenever you need them. They will not have moved. Closing. Everything wrong, everything true. We have spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We traced the contamination from the cracked cooling towers, to the river, to the fish, to the blood of every resident who has spent their life in the shadow of that plant. We examined what yellow skin means and what 4 fingers means and what the specific shape of Homer's cognitive profile reveals about what has been done to him by the town he loves. We sat with the coma and followed its logic through 32 years of increasingly surreal episodes. We reopened the Burns shooting and found, at the center of the official resolution, a confession nobody investigated and a clue the victim himself said was meaningless. We looked at Burns and understood that he is not just old and powerful, he is a system, a self-perpetuating machine for keeping one man alive and one town dependent. We watched Maggie watch everything and understood her silence as the smartest strategic choice anyone in that family has ever made. We followed Mona Simpson's trail from a laboratory in 1969 to a deathbed scene 35 years later and understood what Burns actually took from Homer, not just a mother, but a version of Homer that was never allowed to exist. We watched Springfield vote to expel its own truth. We examined the prediction phenomenon and found something stranger than prophecy, a show that has been inside the culture long enough to begin shaping what the culture is capable of imagining. We stood on Ned Flanders' carefully maintained lawn and understood what a man looks like when he has done everything right and gotten nothing back. We watched Hans Molman die and return and die again, and recognized in his endless cycle the town's most honest statement about its own relationship with consequence. We spent time with the characters at the margins, Willie on his grounds, Skinner in his mother's orbit, Marge at the kitchen window seeing things the show never asks her to report. We trace the way that Springfield's system contains not just the main family but everyone in its gravitational field, drawing them each into specific roles, specific positions, specific relationships to power and powerlessness that the town maintains with the precision of something deliberately engineered. And we came, at the end, to time, to the thing underneath all the other things, to the fact that we have been pressing pause for 36 years and calling it a television show. Every theory in this video is different. They use different evidence, build from different assumptions, arrive at different conclusions about the specific mechanism behind Springfield's strangeness. But they all agree on the basic fact. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural. Something that has been wrong from the beginning and that the show has been documenting in its layered and sometimes involuntary way across its entire run. The theories are our attempt to name that wrongness, to find the story underneath the story, to refuse the surface and insist on looking at what the surface is covering. And what they find, collectively, is this. Springfield is a place where the systems that are supposed to protect people have been arranged to serve power instead, where the institutions that should provide accountability have been captured by the single most powerful actor in the environment, where the residents have been, through various mechanisms, contamination, conditioning, economic dependency, collective agreement, prevented from seeing clearly what has been done to them, and where a family sits on a couch every Sunday night, arguing and laughing and breaking and recovering in the middle of all of it. That family, that specific, recognizable, maddening, deeply loved family, they are why we are here. They are why any of this matters. The theories are interesting. The mysteries are compelling. But what keeps people coming back, what has kept people coming back for 36 years, is not the puzzle of Springfield. It is the feeling of the living room. The feeling of people who love each other struggling to show it in a world that makes struggle the default condition. I want to spend a little time here, in the closing, on what we actually mean when we say we love this show. Because 36 years is a long time to love something, and love that lasts that long usually says something specific about the person who feels it as much as it says something about the thing being loved. Most of the people who watch The Simpsons today did not start watching it as adults with fully formed aesthetic judgments. They started watching it as children, or teenagers, or in the early years of adulthood when the habits of mind that will define a person are still being set. They watched it in a particular room, on a particular television, with particular people nearby or deliberately absent. They watched it as part of a domestic routine that was specific to a time and a household that no longer quite exists in the form it had then. The Simpsons got into people when they were still porous. When the shows and music and films that land in you do not just land in you as entertainment but as the texture of the world, as part of what the world is made of, as one of the things you will always associate with the specific feeling of being alive in a specific period of your own life, the show is inseparable from the years in which people encountered it. It carries those years inside it. When you watch it, even a terrible later episode, even an episode that has none of the specific qualities that made the Golden Age episodes great, you are also watching something that contains the decade in which you first loved it. This is not a trivial thing. The emotional relationship between a viewer and a long-running show that they have grown up with is one of the most intimate relationships in modern cultural life. More intimate in some ways than relationships with books or films or other fixed cultural objects, because the show's ongoing production creates the illusion of a living relationship. The show keeps making more. You keep watching. The relationship has the temporal texture of a real relationship. It has history. It has change. It has the specific dynamics of something you have to keep choosing rather than something you encounter once and carry. And when you have a relationship like that with a show, when you have spent formative years with a family that lives in a house that always looks the same, something happens to the way you perceive the passage of your own life in relation to theirs. Their stability becomes, by contrast, an image of your own change. Their permanent present becomes the fixed point against which you can measure how far you have traveled. You go back to Springfield, and it is exactly as it was, and the gap between its sameness and your own accumulated years is felt as something sharp and specific as grief for a kind of unchangingness that real life does not permit. That is what the floating timeline actually does to the audience. It turns the show into a clock. Not a clock that measures Springfield's time. Springfield has no time to measure. A clock that measures hours. Every time we go back and find Bart still 10, we know something precise about how many years we have been old enough that 10 is a child's age rather than our own. Every time we find Marge still the age she was when we first saw her, we know something about our own distance from the years when we did not think of that age as young. The show is not just entertainment. It is a temporal mirror that only works in one direction. It shows us ourselves without showing us itself aging. And the effect of that, accumulated across 3.5 decades, is something that I think people feel very deeply without usually having the language to describe. Homer is flawed and damaged and limited in ways that the show has spent 36 years finding increasingly dark explanations for. And he is also, in the moments that matter most, just a man who wants to be with his family, who wants his kids to know he loves them, even when he cannot find the words. Who wants Marge to stay even when he has given her every reason not to? Who wants the house on Evergreen Terrace to remain standing against whatever the week has brought, which is usually considerable? He does not have the words for what he wants. He does not have the cognitive capacity to fully articulate or even fully understand his own deepest feelings. But the feelings are there, enormous and genuine, operating underneath the impairment and the comedy and the 36 years of accumulated absurdity. And this is, I think, the most important thing the show does. Not the satire, not the predictions. Not the mystery of who shot Burns or the question of whether Homer is dreaming, or the deeply strange biology of a man who has lived for 130 years on weekly radiation treatments. The most important thing is this. The Simpsons has always insisted, even in its worst episodes, even when everything else about it was failing, that the love is real, not perfect, not uncomplicated. Not the love of people who are good at loving. These are people who are spectacularly bad at loving, who express it clumsily and miss each other constantly, and hurt each other in ways that are sometimes funny and sometimes not, but real, present. The thing that holds the family together is not compatibility or shared values or the functional execution of a domestic partnership. It is something more animal and more durable than any of those things. It is the fact that they need each other, specifically in the way that specific people come to need the specific people they have built a life beside. Homer needs Marge in a way that is deeper than can be fully articulated even in the episodes that try. Marge needs Homer in ways the show has always been more honest about in what it shows than in what it says. Bart needs his father's presence, even though he would never put it that way and might not fully recognize it as a need. Lisa needs her family's warmth even as it consistently fails to be the kind of warmth she can easily receive. Maggie watches all of it with those enormous eyes and keeps her own counsel, but she keeps it surrounded by the family, because the family is where she has chosen to keep it. That is why the coma theory, if it is true, is not a tragedy. It is something else. If Homer's coma dream is an act of love, if his unconscious mind has been holding his family in amber because they are the thing worth holding, then every episode since April 1993 is a father who loves his family. So much that his dreaming mind has been building them a world to live in for 32 years. A world where they are safe, where they are young, where the beer is cold and the couch is comfortable, and the opening credits play every week and the family comes home. There is a version of this story in which the coma theory is the darkest reading, in which the horror is that Homer is dying in a hospital bed, while his family, real and aging and unable to reach him, sits at his bedside watching a man who has gone somewhere they cannot follow. That version of the story is real. It is there if you want to find it. But there is also another version, and I find myself returning to it more often than the dark one. In this version, the dream is the kindest thing a brain can do for a man who loves his family too much to let them go. The coma dream is not a deprivation. It is a gift. A brain that has been damaged, that is losing function, that is in the process of shutting down that brain, chose, as its last act of conscious construction, to build the family a world, to make a Springfield where the kids are always young and the house is always there and the beer is always cold and everything is always a little chaotic and a little warm and a little funny. That is what Homer's damaged, irradiated, 55 IQ brain did with its last resources. It built a home. And if that is what the show is, If that is what we have been watching for 36 years, then every episode is not a failure of serialized storytelling or a decline from an earlier standard. Every episode is an act of love from a man in a hospital bed in Springfield General, keeping his family alive in the only place he can keep them alive. The space between one heartbeat and the next. The dream that does not end as long as someone keeps watching. We keep watching, and so the dream continues, and the family is still there, and that family is still there. Every Sunday night, or whenever you find it, or at 2 in the morning when you need something to watch while you let the day finish dissolving, they are there. Homer comes through the door. Marge is in the kitchen. The kids are somewhere in the house, doing the things they do. The dog is sleeping somewhere. The plant is on the horizon. Burns is alive. The fish have 3 eyes. And if you look very carefully, if you look at Maggie, sitting in her high chair, watching all of this with those enormous eyes, you might catch her for just a moment before she notices you looking, before she adjusts back into the performance of being just a baby. In that moment before she looks away, you can see it, the patience, the watchfulness, the intelligence that has been sitting there for 36 years, accumulating, waiting, biding its time with a discipline that none of the other people in that house come close to matching. She has a plan. She has always had a plan. And when she finally executes it, when the pacifier finally comes out and the first deliberate word in decades comes out of that small yellow mouth, Springfield will not be ready. Nobody will be ready. But whatever she does, she will do it in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the family, because the family, whatever else it is the thing she has chosen to be in. And maybe that is the most honest thing any of us can say about why we keep coming back. Not because Springfield is a good place, not because the Simpsons are a good family in the aspirational sense, but because they are a family that, despite everything done to them by their town and their employer and their own limitations, keeps choosing to be one, keeps choosing each other, keeps gathering around the couch, keeps arguing about nothing important, keeps finding each other at the end of whatever the day was. The couch is still there. The television is still on. The family is still home. And it is late now. Later than you plan to stay up, probably. The world you have to return to in the morning is waiting, with all its own complications and its own slow disasters and its own version of the Burns problem, which is to say, the problem of systems designed to keep you in place while presenting themselves as systems designed to serve you. But that is for tomorrow. Right now, it is late and quiet, and you have spent a long time in Springfield, and you know things about it now that you did not know before. And some of them are dark, and some of them are warm, and most of them are both at the same time, which is, in the end, the feeling the show has always been trying to produce. The credits roll. The couch gag plays backward, or forward, or sideways, some variation you have not seen before and will not see again in that exact form. And then it is quiet, and it is time to sleep. Whatever you found tonight in Springfield, whether it is the dark version or the warm version or some combination of both that you will have to sort out in the morning, I hope it was worth the trip. Springfield is always there. It always will be. Close your eyes,